Section 14 of Travels in Brazil, Volume 1 by Henry Koster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 1. The author sets sail from Gravesend and arrives at Pernambuco. State of Recife. Journey to Bom Jardim with a Capitão Moor, and return to Recife. At the commencement of the winter, my friends again recommended a return to a more temperate climate than that of England, and therefore understanding that the Portuguese ship, the Serra Pequeno, was upon the point of sailing, I took my passage in her. She was lying at Gravesend, and on the 4th of October, 1811, I embarked again for Pernambuco. Contrary winds detained the ship at Portsmouth for about 6 weeks. On the 20th of November, the wind came round to the northward and eastward, and the signal guns from the ships of war, appointed as convoys, awakened us. All was bustle and confusion at Cowes, where great numbers of persons belonging to the ships, who were circumstanced as we were, had stationed themselves. In a few hours the vessels were under way, and before the night closed in, all of them had cleared the Needles. The Serra Pequeno and other Portuguese ships had taken instructions from a frigate, which was bound to the Mediterranean, intending to keep company with her as far as her destination, and theirs obliged them to follow the same course. But in the morning we discovered that we were with another frigate, which was bound to Lisbon. We soon left her, and were accompanied by other 2 Portuguese ships. On the night of the 22nd we fell in with the Kangaroo sloop of war, which was bound to the coast of Africa, with a few vessels under convoy. On the 24th we parted from this convoy, and on the 26th proceeded with only 1 Portuguese ship. Our passage was most prosperous. We had no boisterous weather, and few calms. On the 3rd of December we fell in with the Arethusa frigate, when in sight of the Canary Islands. The captain of the Serra was obliged to take the papers of his ship on board the frigate. The regulations regarding the slave trade, which is carried on by the Portuguese, perhaps occasion more inquiry than would have otherwise been deemed necessary. We crossed the line on the 22nd. In the evening of the 26th we stood for the land, supposing that we had reached the latitude of our port, but that we were very much to the eastward of it. However, we made the land about 2 o'clock in the morning, which was sooner by several hours than the officers of the ship imagined we should. This frequently occurs on board of those vessels which do not carry chronometers, the calculation of longitude, without their assistance, being of course rendered extremely liable to error. At daybreak it was discovered that we were somewhat to the northward of Olinda. We entered the port about 9 o'clock, and came to anchor in the lower harbor called the Poço. The Serra Pequeno is one of the heavy, deep-waisted Brazil ships, requiring a great number of hands to manage her. The business of the ship was carried on in a manner similar in almost all points to that which is practised on board of British merchant vessels. There was, however, less cleanliness observed, and more noise was made. The second officer, who is called in the British merchant service the mate, bears in Portuguese vessels the name of pilot, and the regulations of their marine confine him to the navigation of the ship, giving up to an inferior officer the duty of attending to the discharging or stowage of the hold when loading or unloading, and all other minutiae of the affairs either at sea or in a harbor. I was received on shore by all those persons with whom I had before had the pleasure of being acquainted, with the same friendliness which I always experienced at Pernambuco. Several English gentlemen offered me an apartment in their houses, until I obtained one of my own. I accepted the offer which was made to me by him through whose great kindness my health had been so much benefited after the severe attack of fever which I had suffered in the preceding year. The first few weeks were passed in visits to my friends and acquaintance, with some of whom I occasionally stayed a few days in the neighborhood of the town, which was now much deserted, according to the usual custom, at this season of the year. I perceived a considerable difference in the appearance of Recife and of its inhabitants, although I had been absent from the place for so short a time. Several houses had been altered. The heavy sombre lattice-work had given place, in many instances, to glass windows and iron balconies. Some few families had arrived here from Lisbon, and 3 from England. The ladies of the former had shown the example of walking to Mass in broad daylight, and those of the latter were in the habit of going out to walk toward the close of the day for amusement. These improvements, being once introduced and practised by a few persons, were soon adopted by some who had been afraid to be the first, and others who found that they were pleasant. Formal silks and satins, too, were becoming a less usual dress on high days and holidays, and were now much superseded by white and coloured muslins, and other cotton manufactures. The men likewise, who had in former times daily appeared in full-dress suits of black, gold buckles, and cocked hats, had now in many instances exchanged these for nankeen pantaloons, half-boots, and round hats. Even the high and heavy saddle was now less in use, and that a more modern form was all the fashion. The sedan chairs in which the ladies often go to church, and to pay visits to their friends, had now put on a much smarter appearance, and the men who carried them were dressed more dashingly. These cannot fail to attract the attention of strangers in their gay clothes, their helmets and feathers, and their nankeened legs. The country residences which had been lately built were also numerous. Lands in the vicinity of Recife had risen in price. The trade of brick-making was becoming lucrative. Work-people were in request, and beside many other spots of land, the tract between the villages of Poço da Panela and Monteiro, in extent about 1 mile, which in 1810 was covered with brushwood, had now been cleared. Houses were building and gardens forming upon it. The great church of Corpo Santo, situated in that part of the town which is properly called Recife, was now finished, and various improvements were meditated. Footnote: Before I came away in 1815, a considerable portion of the sand, which was covered by the tide at high water, between St. Antonio and Boa Vista, had been raised, and houses had been built upon it. The principal street of St. Antonio has been paved. The bridge of Boa Vista has been rebuilt of timber, and that between St. Antonio and Recife was about to undergo considerable repair. The hospitals likewise were to be improved, and as I have heard since my arrival in England of the appointment of a most worthy man to the direction of one of them, I trust that this intention has been acted upon. The time of advancement was come, and men who had for many years gone on without making any change either in the interior or exterior of their houses were now painting and glazing on the outside, and new furnishing within, modernizing themselves, their families, and their dwellings. This spirit of alteration produced, in one case, rather ludicrous consequences. There was a lady of considerable dimensions who had entered into this love of innovation, and carried it to a vast extent. She was almost equal in circumference and height, but notwithstanding this unfortunate circumstance, personal embellishments were not to be despised. She wished to dress in English fashion, and was herself decidedly of opinion that she had succeeded. Upon her head she wore a very small gypsy hat tied under the chin. Stays have only lately been introduced, but this improvement she had not yet adopted. Still, her gown was to be in English fashion too, and therefore was cut and slashed away, so as to leave most unmercifully in view several beauties which otherwise would have remained concealed. This gown was of muslin, and was worked down the middle and round the bottom in several colors. Her shoes were as small as could be allowed, but the unfortunate redundance of size also reached the ankles and the feet, and thus rendering compression necessary. The superabundance which nature had lavishly bestowed projected and hung down over each side of the shoes. I became acquainted and somewhat intimate with the Capitão Mor of a neighboring district from frequently meeting him in my evening visits to a Brazilian family. He was about to make the circuit of his district in the course of a few weeks, and invited one of my friends and myself to accompany him in this review or visit to his officers, to which we readily agreed. It was arranged that he should make us acquainted in due time with the day which he might appoint for setting out, that we might meet him at his sugar plantation, from whence we were to proceed with him and his suite further into the country. The Capitães Mores, captains major, are officers of considerable power. They have civil as well as military duties to perform, and ought to be appointed from among the planters of most wealth and individual weight in the several termos, boundaries or districts. But the interest of family or of relations about the court have occasioned deviations from this rule, and persons very unfit for these situations have been sometimes nominated to them. The whole aspect of the government in Brazil is military. All men between the ages of 16 and 60 must be enrolled either as soldiers of the line, as militiamen, or as belonging to the body of ordenanças. Of the regular soldiers I have already spoken in another place. Of the second class, each township has a regiment, of which the individuals, with the exception of the major and adjutant, and in some cases the colonel, do not receive any pay. But they are considered as embodied men, and as such are called out upon some few occasions in the course of the year to assemble in uniform and otherwise accoutred. The expense which must be incurred in this respect of necessity precludes the possibility of many persons becoming members of this class, even if the government were desirous of increasing the number of militia regiments. The soldiers of these are subject to their captains, to the colonel, and to the governor of the province. The colonels are either rich planters, or the major or lieutenant colonel of a regiment of the line is thus promoted to the command of one of these. In this case, and in this case only, he receives pay. I am inclined to think that he ought to possess some property in the district, and that any deviation from this rule is an abuse, but I am not certain that the law so ordains. The majors and the adjutants are likewise occasionally promoted from the line, but whether they are regularly military men or planters, they receive pay, as their trouble in distributing orders and in other arrangements connected with the regiment is considerable. The third class, that of the ordenanças, consisting of by far the largest portion of the white persons, and of free mulatto men of all shades, have for their immediate chiefs the Capitães Mores, who serve without pay, and all the persons who are connected with the ordenanças are otherwise likewise to afford their services gratuitously. Each district contains one Capitão Mor, who is invariably a person possessing property in the part of the country to which he is appointed. He is assisted by a major, captains, and alferes, who are lieutenants or ensigns, and by sergeants and corporals. The duties of the Capitão Mor are to see that every individual under his command has in his possession some species of arms, either a firelock, a sword, or a pike. He distributes the governor's orders through his district, and can oblige any of his men to take these orders to the nearest captain, who sends another peasant forwards to the next captain, and so forth. All which is done without pay. A Capitão Mor can also imprison for 24 hours, and send under arrest for trial a person who is accused of having committed any crime, to the civil magistrate of the town to which his district is immediately attached. Now the abuses of this office of Capitão Mor are very many, and the lower orders of free persons are much oppressed by these great men, and by their subalterns, down to the corporals. The peasants are often sent upon errands which have no relation to public business. For leagues and leagues these poor fellows are made to travel, for the purpose of carrying some private letter of their chief or his captains or of his lieutenants, without any remuneration. Indeed, many of these men in place seldom think of employing their slaves on these occasions, or repaying the free person so employed. This I have witnessed times out of number, and have heard the peasants in all parts of the country complain. It is a most heavy grievance. Nothing so much vexes a peasant as the consciousness of losing his time and trouble in a service which is not required by his sovereign. Persons are sometimes confined in the stocks for days together on some trifling plea, and are at last released without being sent to the civil magistrate, or even admitted to a hearing. However, I am happy to say that I am acquainted with some men whose conduct is widely different from what I have above stated, but the power given to an individual is too great, and the probability of being called to an account for its abuse too remote, to ensure the exercise of it in a proper manner. The free mulattoes and free negroes whose names are upon the rolls, either of the militia regiments which are commanded by white officers, or by those of their own class and color, are not, properly speaking, subject to the Capitán Mores. These officers and the colonels of militia are appointed by the supreme government, and the subaltern officers are nominated by the governor of each province. The above explanation of the state of internal government I thought necessary, that the reader might understand the grounds upon which I was about to undertake the journey, of which some account will immediately be given. On the 28th of January, 1812, the Capitán Mor sent one of his servants to summon us to his plantation, and to be our guide. Early on the morning following, my friend, myself, our own 2 servants, and the boy who had been sent to us by the Capitán Mor, set out on horseback in high spirits, my friend and I expecting to see something new and strange. I had before, as has already been related, travelled into the less populous parts of the country, but I had had very little communication with the planters. On that occasion I proceeded too rapidly to obtain as much knowledge of their manners and customs as I wished. We proceeded to Olinda and passed through its wretchedly paved streets with much care, and when we were descending the hill upon which it stands on the land side, there was laid open to us a considerable extent of marshy ground, which was partly covered with mandioc, planted upon raised beds or hillocks, which were made of a circular form, that the water might not reach the roots of the plants. The remainder of the land was still undrained and unproductive. The darkness of the green of the plants which grow upon marshy ground immediately points out the lands that are in this state. The country which was to be seen in the distance was covered with wood. We crossed a rivulet communicating with the marshy land on each side of the road, and passed on over some rising ground, and by several scattered cottages, until we reached, distant from Olinda 1 league, the lowland surrounding the hill which forms the site of the sugar plantation of Fragoso. From hence the lands are low and damp, almost without any rising ground, to the sugar plantation of Paulistas. The beautiful spots upon this tract of land are numerous. Cottages are oftentimes to be met with, half concealed among the trees and brushwood. They are built of mud, and are covered with the leaves of cocoa trees. They have usually a projecting penthouse with a small area in front, which is clear of weeds. Under this penthouse is slung the hammock, with its dark-colored owner, idly swinging backwards and forwards, who raises his head as he hears the horse's footsteps. The dog is basking in the sun, or lying under the shade, or running out to annoy the traveller, and the fishing baskets and the gourds hang as chance directs them upon the protruding items of the cocoa leaves which cover the lowly hut. Sometimes the sight of these rude dwellings is enlivened by the figure of a female, who runs off and conceals herself, as the passenger upon the road looks down the narrow path which leads to the cottage. The road itself was likewise narrow, for this was not the great cattle track, and all view of the country was generally shut out by the wood on each side, against which the legs of the horseman are often brushing, and into which he is obliged to force his horse, if he should chance to meet a carrier, with his panniers or his cotton bags on either side of his beast, or one of the carts which are employed upon the plantations. The mamoero produces its fruit upon the stem. The fruit is large, and the pulp of it is soft, having much resemblance in consistence and in taste to a melon that is too ripe. The appearance of the fruit has some similarity likewise to a small round melon. To those who are unaccustomed to a country that is literally covered with woods, which prevent an extensive view of the surrounding objects, and the free circulation of air, the delightful sensations which are produced by a fine green field opening all at once to the sight, and swept by a refreshing breeze, cannot possibly be felt. The plantation of Paulistas is so situated. The buildings were numerous, but most of them were low, and somewhat out of repair, These are the dwelling house of the owner, which is spacious, and is one story above the ground floor, the chapel with its large wooden cross erected upon the centre of the gable end, the mill and square building without walls, its roof being supported upon brick pillars, the long row of negro huts, the steward's residence, and several others of minor importance. These edifices are all of them scattered upon a large field, which is occupied by a considerable number of tame cattle. This is skirted by a dike which runs in front, but somewhat at a distance from the dwelling house of the owner, and through it runs the water which turns the mill. On the opposite side of the field is the chaplain's cottage, with its adjoining lesser row of negro huts, its plantain garden, and its wide-spreading mango trees behind it. Beyond the principal house are low and extensive cane and meadow lands, which are skirted on one side by the buildings of another small plantation, and bordered at a great distance by woods, which are situated upon the sides and summit of rising ground. This valuable and beautiful plantation was in the possession of a near relation of our Capitan Mor. We were acquainted with the son of the owner, who was chaplain to the estate, and had invited us to make his residence our resting place. This we did. He was prepared to receive us, and after having breakfasted, we proceeded to pay a visit to the old gentleman at the great house, as the dwellings of the owners of plantations are called. He was unwell and could not be seen, but we were received by his wife and 2 daughters. They made many inquiries about England, and conversed upon other subjects which they supposed we might be acquainted with. This estate was not much worked. The slaves led a most easy life, and the great house was full of young children. Of these urchins, several came in and out of the room. They were quite naked, and played with each other, and with some large dogs which were lying at full length upon the floor. These ebon cupids were plainly great favourites, and seemed to employ the greater part of the thoughts of the good ladies, the youngest of whom was on the wrong side of 50, and even the priest laughed at their gambols. These excellent women and the good priest possess a considerable number of slaves, who are their exclusive property. It is their intention eventually to emancipate all of them, and that they may be prepared for the change, several of the men have been brought up as mechanics of different descriptions, and the women have been taught needlework, embroidery, and all branches of culinary knowledge. Thus, by the death of 4 individuals, who are now approaching to old age, will be set free about 60 persons, men, women, and children. As these people have been made acquainted with the intentions of their owners respecting them, it is not surprising that the behavior of many of them should be overbearing. To some the deeds of manumission have been already passed conditionally, obliging them to serve as slaves until the death of the individual to whom they are subject. These papers cannot be revoked, and yet no ingratitude was apprehended. But among so considerable a number of persons, some instances of it cannot, I fear, fail to be experienced. The owners said that all their immediate relations are rich, and not all in need of assistance, and that therefore, independent of other reasons, connected generally with the system of slavery, these their children had no right to work for anyone else. Of the slaves in question, only a few are Africans, the major part being mulattoes and Creole negroes. We returned to the cottage of the priest to dinner, and in the afternoon proceeded to the sugar plantation of Aguiar, belonging to the Capitan Mor, which is distant from Paulistas 5 leagues, where we arrived about 10 o'clock at night, much fatigued. Immediately beyond Paulistas is the narrow rapid stream of Paratibi, which, near to its mouth, changes this name for that of Dulce. In the rainy season it overflows its banks and becomes unfordable. The width of it, when it is in the usual state, near to Paulistas, is not above 20 yards. In its course to the sea it runs through much marshy ground. We passed by 4 sugar mills this afternoon. That which bears the name of Utringa de Beixo is situated in an amphitheatre, being surrounded by high hills covered with large trees. These woods have not been much disturbed, and therefore give refuge to enormous quantities of game, among which the porco domato, or pig of the woods, is common. I never saw this animal, and therefore cannot pretend to describe it, but I have often heard it spoken of as being extremely destructive to mandioc, and its flesh is good. This animal is not large, and is not unlike the common hog. Footnote: Bolingbroke says that instances are frequent of some of the European swine escaping into the woods, where they live wild, and he adds that their increase has been immense. In another place he speaks of a species of this animal, which is peculiar to tropical America, and is called the wari, which he says is about the size of an European hog, and much like it in shape. The porco domato is not the sus tajasu, which is, I imagine, what Bolingbroke calls the peccary hog. Voyage to the Demery, etc., by Henry Bolingbroke in Phillips' Collection of Modern Voyages, Volume 10, page 57 and 129. The tajacu is to be met with at Maranhão, but is not known at Pernambuco. End footnote. Many criminals and runaway Negroes are harbored in these woods. The inhabitants of Otinga seem to be shut out from all the rest of the world, as the path which leads from it is not immediately distinguishable. The last 3 leagues, which we traversed in the dark, were covered with almost unbroken woods. The path through them is narrow, and the branches of the trees cross it in all directions. Our guide rode in front, and many times did his head come in contact with them. The dwelling of the Capitán Mor is a large building, of 1 story above the ground floor, the lower part of which forms the warehouse for the sugar and other articles which the estate produces. We ascended a wooden staircase erected on the outside of the building, entered a small antechamber, and were received by our host and one of his sons, who conducted us into a spacious apartment beyond. A long table and one of rather less dimensions, a couple of benches, and a few broken and unpainted chairs form the whole furniture of these rooms. 4 or 5 black boys, who were of a size too far advanced to wear the bow and arrow, but who were quite as little encumbered with dress as they still might wield these dangerous weapons in the character of Cupids, stood all astonishment to view the strange beings that had just arrived, and at all the doors were women's heads peeping to see whom we might be. The supper consisted, as is usual, of great quantities of meat placed upon the table without arrangement. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the Capitán Mor, my friend, myself, and 3 servants, proceeded to the distance of 3 leagues without any addition to our party, but we were soon joined by the adjutant of the district and several other officers, in uniforms of dark blue with yellow facings most monstrously broad, the gay cuffs reaching halfway up to the elbow. They wore round hats with short feathers, straight swords of most prodigious length, and very loose nankeen pantaloons and boots. The former were thrust within the latter, which caused the higher part of the pantaloons to appear to be of preposterous width. We dismounted at a sugar plantation, being the 3rd we had passed through this morning. Here we were invited to stay to breakfast, but this we could not do, and were therefore regaled with pineapples and oranges. The owner of this place had taken great pains with his garden, and had reared several fruits which require much care. But it is strange that, although there are many which may be raised with very little trouble, still upon far the greater number of plantations, even oranges are not to be found. The ant is, I well know, a great persecutor of this tree, but when care is taken in this respect, and a little water is afforded during the dry months for 2 or 3 years, none else is necessary. Upon the same plantation have been practiced the most monstrous cruelties. The conduct of the owner towards his slaves is often spoken of with abhorrence, but yet he is visited and treated with the same respect which is paid to an individual of unblemished character. It is, however, almost the only instance of which I heard of systematic, continued, wanton enormity. But it has here occurred, and has passed unpunished, and this one is sufficient, even if none other existed, to stamp the slave system as an abomination which ought to be rooted out. The estate was inherited by the person in question, with 60 good slaves upon it. 15 years had elapsed since this time to the period of which I speak, and there were then remaining only 4 or 5 individuals who were able to work. Some have fled and have escaped. Others have died, God knows how, and others again have committed suicide in sight of their master's residence. We arrived at midday at Santa Cruz, and had now reached the cotton country. The tract through which we had passed was for the most part well watered and well wooded, the marshy lands being less frequently interspersed than upon the journey of the preceding day. The sugar plantations were numerous. We saw 8 of them this morning. The ground was often uneven, and we crossed one rather steep hill. The lands upon which we had now arrived, and those to which we were advancing, are altogether higher, and the grass upon them was now much burnt up, the first waters not having yet fallen. The soil in these parts retains less moisture than that of the country which we had left, and soon becomes too hard to be worked. The party was now much increased, and in the afternoon we proceeded to Pindoba, a cotton plantation of considerable extent. The owner of it is wealthy and possesses many slaves. He received us in his dressing gown, under which he wore a shirt, drawers, and a pair of stockings. After the first greetings were over, he brought out a small bottle of liqueur made in the country, to which he himself helped his guests, one solitary glass, which was filled, and then emptied by each person, being made use of by the whole party. After supper, a guitar player belonging to the house entertained us until a late hour, whilst our host sat upon a table smoking from a pipe full 6 feet in length. Several hammocks were slung in 2 large apartments, and each person either talked or went to sleep, or occasionally did one and the other, no form of ceremony being observed. The peasants began to assemble early on the following morning, as 3 companies of the ordenanzas were to be reviewed. These were the first which were to undergo inspection, as the Capitan Mor proposed visiting again the places through which we had passed on his return, and intended then to perform this duty. The men wore their usual dress of shirt and drawers, and perhaps a nankeen jacket and pantaloons were added, and most of them had muskets. The Capitan Mor came forth this day in his scarlet uniform, and sat himself down near to a table. The captain of the company, which was about to be reviewed, stood near to him with a muster roll. The names of the privates were called over by the captain, and as each name was repeated by the sergeant, who stood at the doorway, the individual to whom it belonged came in and presented arms to the Capitan Mor, then turned about and retired. It was truly ridiculous, but at the same time painful, to see the fright which the countenances of some of the poor fellows expressed, and their excessive awkwardness when they came to present themselves, whilst others displayed evident self-sufficiency. These were well dressed, and performed every maneuver with as much neatness and promptitude as they were capable of, expressive of superior knowledge, and in hopes of admiration. There were, of course, many absentees, and for the non-appearance of these some reason was given by one of the officers of the company to which the man belonged, or by a neighbor. The excuses were usually received as sufficient, without any further inquiry being made. However, the absence of one of the captains was not thus quietly acquiesced in, and therefore an officer was dispatched to his house to bring him to Pendoba under an arrest. Whether this proceeded from some private pique or some zeal for the public service, I do not pretend to determine, but he soon arrived in custody. He was put into one of the apartments of the house which we were inhabiting, and a sergeant was stationed at the door as a sentinel. The Capitan Mor soon, however, relented, upon which he was released and allowed to return home. At dinner the great man took the head of the table, and the owner of the house stood by and waited upon him. Everything was served up in enormous quantities, for the party was large, and this is the custom. There was no sort of regularity observed. Every man helped himself to the dish which pleased him best, and this was oftentimes done with the knife which the person had been making use of upon his own plate, and by reaching across 2 or 3 of his neighbors for the purpose. A nice bit was not safe even upon one's own plate, being occasionally snatched up, and another less dainty given in return. Much wine was drank during dinner, and the glasses were used in common. We soon rose from table, and the party, generally speaking, took the accustomed siesta or nap after dinner which is usual in warm climates. My friend and I walked out in the afternoon, but there was nothing to tempt us to go far, for the neighborhood possessed no natural beauty, and the dry weather had burnt up the grass and had made the face of the country extremely dreary. Early on the morrow about 40 persons sallied forth from the village of Bom Jardim. It is distant from Pindoba 1 league and a half. We arrived there at 7 o'clock. This village is built in the form of a square. The houses are low, but the church is large and handsome. Like the huts of Assu and of some other places, those of Bom Jardim are not whitewashed, and therefore the mud of which they are composed remains in its original color. The place contains about 500 inhabitants. We ascended a steep hill to arrive at it, and on the opposite side still another of equal height is to be surmounted in proceeding farther inland. The village is situated upon a break of the hill. The soil is chiefly composed of red earth, approaching in places to a bright scarlet, with veins of yellow running through it. This is the description of soil which is said to be the best adapted to the growth of cotton. Bom Jardim is a great rendezvous for the hawkers who are proceeding to the Sertão, and for others who merely advance thus far. It is distant from Recife 20 good leagues in a northeast direction. End of section 14. Section 15 of Travels in Brazil, Volume 1 by Henry Koster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Part 2. My friend and I walked out and descended the hill by a path which led us to the bed of the river, for there was now no water in it. Great want of water is often experienced at Bom Jardim, but I think that if wells of sufficient depth were dug, a supply might be obtained. Footnote: Directions were given by the Capitão Mor that a reservoir for rainwater should be formed, and these have been carried into effect. 1815. End footnote. On our return to the village, we discovered that Mass was about to be said, and therefore we accompanied some of our party to the church. It was crowded. Indeed, it is a remark which I was frequently led to make, that on Sundays and holidays, when the peasantry assemble at the church doors, their numbers must astonish those persons who merely pass through the country, without opportunities being afforded to them of a more minute examination. The cottages upon the roadside do not promise so numerous a population as is on these occasions to be seen. But from the thickness of the woods and the lowness of the huts, even when a view of the country is by any accident to be obtained from a high hill, the dwellings of the lower orders of people are not to be perceived. They are scattered all over the country, and narrow paths which appear impassable, or nearly so, and are scarcely to be observed, often lead to 4 or 5 huts, situated in the center of a wood or upon some low ground, adapted to the cultivation of mandioc and maize. One company was reviewed at Bom Jardim, and from hence a captain was deputed to continue the review further into the country. We rode this afternoon 1 league to the house of Captain Anselmo, being so far upon our return. On our way to this place we saw the woods on one side of the road on fire. In the dry season the grass and brushwood become so completely parched that the least spark sets a whole tract of country in a blaze. I mean that the fire will sometimes run on for a league, and even more, will occasionally blaze forth most violently, and catching the branches of the large trees, the flames will at intervals flash above the summit, will then subside, but continue smothered in the hollow of some aged tree, and in a heap of leaves which still retain some moisture. But a breath of air spreads it abroad, and it again runs on with violence. The peasants almost invariably smoke as they go along, and oftentimes they ask for a lighted piece of wood at a cottage which they may chance to pass. It is astonishing to see with what unconcern they will hurl this from them, still unextinguished, knowing as they do full well the consequences which frequently have ensued. The act of setting fire to a wood is subject to punishment by law, if intention, or even carelessness can be proved. The crop of canes of some estates have, in many instances, been injured by these means. Captain Anselmo resides upon a cotton plantation, which is his own property, and is cultivated by about 40 negroes. The house is situated upon the shelf of a steep hill, with a beautiful plain below, upon which trees are thickly scattered. At the foot of the hill is a large fish pond, through which a rivulet runs in the rainy season. The owner has lately enclosed a piece of land, and was making a garden upon the borders of the pond. The dwelling house was new, and had a second floor. It was very clean and well furnished. This was the most pleasantly situated and the best arranged mansion which we visited during this journey. The huts for the slaves were well built and looked comfortable. Here we were entertained with such music as has as yet found its way into these parts of the country. 3 negroes with bagpipes attempted to play a few tunes whilst we were at dinner, but they seemed to play in different keys from each other, and sometimes each appeared to have struck up a tune of his own composing. I think I never heard so bad an attempt at producing harmonious sounds as the charamaleros made. The possession of a band of these bespeaks a certain degree of superiority. Consequently, the planters pride themselves upon their musicians. Our party could not let pass this opportunity of beginning together without practicing the amusement of the intrudo. Footnote: the Monday and Tuesday before Ash Wednesday are properly the days of the intrudo, but the sport is, as in the case in question, often commenced a week before the appointed time. Water and hair powder are the ingredients which are established to be hurled at each other, but frequently no medium is preserved, and everything is taken up heedlessly and thrown about by all parties, whether it be clean or dirty, whether it may do mischief or is harmless. End footnote. Although the usual time of its celebration was yet distant 1 week. On the day subsequent to that of our arrival, dinner was scarcely over before the farinha, the bananas, the rice, and other dainties upon the table, were hurled at each other's heads. Soon the smart uniform coats were taken off, and in his shirt-sleeves each man began the civil war with heart and soul. Everything was borne with perfect good humor, and at last, fatigued and bedaubed, all of us retired to the hammocks which had been provided for the party. But as our evil stars would have it, a brave captain closed quietly all the shutters, as the moon was shining very bright in the room, and then he placed himself near to an enormous jar of water, which stood in one corner of the apartment, and with a small pitcher in his hand soon dealt around him its contents, awakening us with repeated showers, and obliging us to take shelter under the chairs and tables. This, and other jokes allied to it, continued until the break of day, when we prepared for a continuation of our journey. One company was reviewed here. We proceeded to the house of Captain Paolo Travasso, distant 1 league. As was our usual custom, my friend and I walked out soon after our arrival, and in returning, instead of pursuing the path, which was rather circuitous, we attempted to climb up a bank, that we might the sooner reach the house. My friend was before me, and as he scrambled up to it, his foot slipped, which caused him to catch at the stump of a small plant that grew upon the side of the bank. He gave up his idea of going by that way to the house, and returned to me, bringing with him the plant, with its root and the earth about it. On going to throw it away, he perceived upon his hand the glitter of a substance which made us return to the spot. We gathered some more of the earth, and this gentleman, who had long resided upon the coast of Africa, judged the substance which was mixed with it to be gold dust. At this place the intrudo was continued more violently than before, for even the blackened pots and pans from the kitchen were introduced to besmear each other's faces. We obtained here a view of the females belonging to the house, but everywhere else they had been too rigorously guarded, or were naturally too reserved to enable us to see them. Some excuse was made by the young men who were acquainted with the family to draw them into sport, and the ladies and their slaves were nothing loath to see and to participate in what was going forwards. A circumstance occurred which created much laughter, and which is but too characteristic. One man whom we met in this place had all along begged of those who were engaged in the sport that they would not wet him, because he was unwell. However, it was seen that he did not observe towards others the forbearance which he entreated from them toward himself. One of the party, seeing this, attacked him with a large silver ladle filled with water. The man ran out of the house, and the other followed. But when they were at some distance from it, he turned upon his pursuer, and drawing his knife, stood at some distance, threatening to stab him if he advanced. The other, striking his left side at the place in which knives are usually carried, likewise threatened him, and without delay advanced toward him, having picked up a thick stick as he approached. But his adversary did not like the thoughts of a close combat, and soon set off at full speed, with his knife in his hand. In this manner he entered the back door of the house, whilst he of the silver ladle took the front door. They met in the apartment from which they had started, when the latter opened his waistcoat, and showed that he had not a knife, thus proving before the whole party that he with the knife had run away from one who was unarmed. This was quite sufficient. The women made a general attack upon him. He went to the stable, mounted his horse, and set forth. But his misfortunes had not yet ended, for the path by which he must retreat lay under two of the windows of the house, and as he passed, 2 large tubs of water drenched him and his steed, which immediately quickened its pace amidst the hooting of everyone present. We continued our journey in the afternoon to a sugar plantation, the property of Captain João Soares, where we remained until the following day. Some of us were tired of the intrudo, and therefore sought shelter in the mill and adjoining outhouses when we saw the sport again commencing. But we were about to be attacked when we gained the roofs of one of the buildings, and from hence could not be dislodged. I had frequently seen the saboeira, or soap tree, which is to be chiefly found in these districts. It is a large shrub, which puts forth numerous branches in every direction, so that when it is in full leaf it has somewhat the appearance of trees that have been clipped, as was formerly practised in gardens, which is increased by the leaves being small and growing very close to each other. The receptacle of the seed is about the size of a small plum. When this is put into water, and rubbed with some violence, it produces the same effect as that which is caused by soap and water, and it has the same property of cleansing. The pau do alho, or garlic tree, is to be met with in great abundance in these districts. The name is derived from the similitude of the smell of the leaves and the wood of this plant to garlic. The tree abounds so greatly, and I suppose reminded the first settlers so much of one of their favorite European culinary ingredients, that it has given name to a town and to a whole district. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon we proceeded to Limoeiro, a large and thriving village. Footnote: Limoeiro was raised to a township by an alvará issued from Rio de Janeiro on the 27th of July, 1811, but this was not then known. It has now a mayor, municipality, and capitão-mor. End footnote. It is composed of one street of about 3/4 of a mile in length, which is closed at one end by the church and vicarage. This building belonged formerly to the Jesuits. The trade of Limoeiro with the interior is considerable, and particularly on the day of the market, which is held weekly, the bustle is excessive. These days seldom pass without some murders being committed, or at least many wounds and blows being given. But the markets of Nazareth, or Lagoa d'Anta, are those which are particularly famed for the disturbances that usually take place there. These became so considerable at one time that the governor found it necessary to issue orders for a patrol to keep the peace on market days. Limoeiro contains about 600 inhabitants and is increasing daily. It stands upon the banks of the river Capibaribe, which was at this time quite dry. The distance from Recife is 14 good leagues. We were entertained by the vicar, who has taken very little pains to have a decent residence, and cannot fail to be somewhat indifferent about his own life. For every step to which we advanced as we ascended to the apartments above promised to be the last that would hold us. The floors of the rooms into which we were ushered seemed to be laid out as traps to ensnare those who might not tread cautiously. Some of the boards were broken, and large holes remained. Others were loose, and it was dangerous to pass over them. And besides the several perils of this mansion, substances which are not pleasant to the nose might unwarily be trampled upon. Never did I see so miserable a dwelling, whose inhabitant might with so much case have bettered the state in which we found it. However, I ought not to complain, for to counterbalance all this we had a teapot, sugar basin, and other parts of the equipage of silver. The Capitan Mor had still several posts to visit, which would delay him for a considerable time. Therefore, as my friend was anxious to return to Recife, we left our party, with much regret, and were accompanied in the morning by the adjutant, who was about to return home. I had been greatly amused, and wished to have seen the conclusion of the affair. At Limoeiro several companies were to be reviewed, and from thence the Capitan Mor proceeded to Pau do Alho. Footnote: This place was erected a township by the same Alvara which was issued respecting Limoeiro, and by the same the village of Cape St. Augustine and of St. Anthem were likewise raised to the rank of towns, a sure sign of the increase of population. End footnote. And Nazareth, or Lagoa d'Anta. Footnote: This village is as much or more generally known by the name of Lagoa d'Anta than by that of Nazareth, but the latter is the name which it bears in law. The former name, which means the lake of the Anta, seems to denote that the animal was known in this part of the country, but in the present day I could not meet with any of the peasants who knew what the word Anta was intended to signify. Close footnote. Two large villages of considerable importance. Both of them are within a few leagues of the place at which we separated from our companions. We returned to Santa Cruz, passed through that village, and were entertained at the house of the adjutant. We reached Aguiar in the afternoon, being received at that place by one of the Capitan Mor's sons, a young man of 18 years of age, and we also saw the Capitan Mor's interesting wife, who was likewise his niece. She was about 15 years of age, he being about 46. We slept there, and stopped at Paulistas on the following day at noon, from whence we proceeded to Recife on the evening of the 6th of February. I heard one of the sugar planters bitterly complaining of his poverty, and that his want of hands to work his mill obliged him to give up the cultivation of much of the best land of his estate. Soon after he had uttered these complaints, the conversation turned upon saddle horses and their trappings, and he then told us that he had lately purchased a new saddle and bridle, which he wished us to see. These new trappings were most superb affairs. The saddle was made of Morocco leather and green velvet, and silver-headed nails, and plates of the same metal were profusely scattered and placed upon all parts of this and of the bridle. He told us that the whole had cost him 400 mil-réis, about 110 pounds. This sum of money would have purchased 4 slaves. But the matter did not end here, for he opened a drawer in which were strewed several broken silver spoons, spurs, etc., and he said that he was collecting a sufficient quantity of this metal for the purpose of having his groom's horse ornamented in the same manner as his own. The free persons of color who inhabit the tract of country through which we passed are more numerous than I had previously imagined. The companies of ordenanzas vary much in strength. Some consist of 150 men and more, and others of not above 50. The peasantry of the Mata, that is, of the country which lies between the plentiful, well-watered districts of the coast and the sertões, have not a general good character. The miserable life which they, oftener than others, are obliged to lead, from the want of water and of provisions, seems to have an unfavorable effect upon them. They are represented as being more vindictive and more quarrelsome and less hospitable than their neighbors. To say that a man is a matuto da mata, a woodman of the wood, is no recommendation to him. During this journey I heard the following story, and as I was acquainted with the person to whom the circumstances occurred, I can vouch for its veracity. A Brazilian who had been wealthy, but who had through many imprudencies, and from many deeds which deserve a much severer name, reduced himself to a state of comparative poverty, resided in this part of the country at the time I traveled through it. He was a man of loose morals and savage disposition, but of most pleasant manners. He had, in one particular instance, which preeminently stamped his character, behaved in a most shameful manner to a lady to whom he professed himself to be attached. He had possessed many slaves, but at the time the following occurrence took place, 3 or 4 only remained, and of these 1 alone was in health. Apprehensive of being assassinated by some of the persons whom he had injured and insulted, he usually kept the doors and windows of his residence well secured, excepting one entrance, which was likewise closed at dusk. One evening 3 men knocked at the door, and asked leave to pass the night in some of the outhouses of the plantation. The owner answered from within, but did not open the door, saying that they might sleep in the mill. About an hour afterwards there was another knock, and a person requested that some fruit might be sold to him. The owner fetched some, and inconsiderately opened the door to give it to the man. But when he looked out, all the 3 were there, and as he reached the fruit to one of them, a second fired, and the greatest part of the shot entered the abdomen. The known courage of the wounded man made these fellows hesitate in approaching him immediately, by which means he had time to reach his sword, which stood near to where he was, and he was enabled to close and bolt the door. This being done, he reached his bed with great difficulty, expecting that every minute would be his last. The men tried to gain admittance through some of the doors or windows, but not succeeding in this, they rode off. As soon as the slave who was in health heard the report of the gun, and saw his master wounded, he made all haste to a neighboring plantation, distant 1 league. The owner of the place to which the slave had fled ordered a hammock to be prepared, and set off with 16 negroes. He was accompanied by his chaplain, who brought with him a candle and all the other necessary appendages to the bedside of a dying Catholic. They arrived and found the wounded man in a state which led them to suppose that he could not live many hours, but he was confessed and anointed with the holy oil, and thus prepared for the worst. Then they put him into the hammock, and his neighbor had him conveyed to his residence. The person who related the story to me did not fail to add that a lighted candle was carried in a lantern, that the wounded man should not run the risk of dying without having the light in his hand, as is the custom. A surgeon was sent for to Iguaraçu, which is distant several leagues, and he succeeded in extracting almost all the shot. Notwithstanding the delay and other unfavorable circumstances, I saw this man in good health in 1813. Whilst he still remained in a dangerous state at the house of his friend, a Sertanejo Indian, well armed, passed through the place, and asked one of the negroes if he was still alive. It was generally said that he must remove to some far distant part of the country, otherwise he might daily expect another attack, and particularly as his enemies were Sertanejos. The men who had attempted to murder him were dressed after the manner of these people, and were seen on the following day traveling towards the interior. They mentioned, at some of the cottages at which they stopped, that they believed they had prevented one man from eating any more piram, which is equal to an European using in the same manner the word bread. The person whom they had attacked could not be sure of the quarter from whence the blow proceeded, for many were those from which he might have expected it. In Brazil, injured persons or their relatives must either allow their own wrongs and those of their families to go unpunished, or they must themselves undertake the chastisement of him who has committed the crime. The evil proceeds immediately from the vastness of the country, and from the want of attention in the government to counteract this disadvantage. End of section 15. Section 16 of Travels in Brazil, Volume 1, by Henry Koster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Part 1. Residence at Jaguaribe. Journey to Guiana. Illness. Return to Jaguaribe. After the journey to Bom Jardim, I did not again leave Recife for any length of time, until I entered with a friend into a scheme of farming. It had been greatly my wish to remove from the town into the country, from preference rather than from any other cause. In the beginning of April, 1812, we rented the sugar plantation of Jaguaribe, distant from Recife 4 leagues, in a northward direction, and about 1 league from the coast. It had upon it several slaves, oxen, machinery, and implements, which enabled the new tenant to enter it immediately. A few days after these matters were arranged, I accompanied the owner to the plantation for the purpose of meeting the person who was about to leave it, being the second visit which I had made to my intended place of residence. Having agreed with this man, the owner and myself returned to sleep at the dwelling of one of his brothers, which was situated about 1.5 miles from the coast. This person had purchased some lands, which he was now clearing, and upon which he was erecting several buildings. He and his family inhabited a barn, and were to sleep in his new house, of which the roof and the woodwork of the walls were alone erected. The rainy season had commenced, and this unfinished dwelling was almost surrounded by pools of stagnant water, inhabited by enormous toads, whose loud and hoarse croaking continued during the whole of the night, without intermission. The trunks of the trees, which had been cut down a short time before, were lying as they had fallen in all directions. In the morning I set off alone on my return to Recife. I made for the seashore, and soon reached the river Doce, a narrow stream which, after a course of 4 or 5 leagues, here discharges into waters into the sea. The tide enters it, and again recedes with considerable rapidity. At such times it is not fordable, but at the ebb the remaining waters are very trifling, and some parts of the channel are left quite dry. It is necessary to pass quickly over, as the sand of which its bed is composed is very fine, and although not altogether what is called quicksand, still to delay in one spot is not quite safe. When the tide is out, the water of the river is quite sweet, which has obtained for it the name of Doce. It was upon the borders of this river that the Portuguese and the Dutch were first opposed to each other in this part of Brazil. Footnote: History of Brazil, Volume 1, pages 467 and 468. End footnote. Here commenced the memorable struggle upon which the Pernambucans, with so much reason, pride themselves. The beginning was not propitious, and did not augur well of the result, but time proved the people to be worthy of the beautiful country which they inhabit. The river Tapado, upon the banks of which the Portuguese commander afterwards attempted to rally his men, lies between the Doce and Olinda. It is a rivulet or dike, for it resembles more the latter than the former, without any outlet to the sea, but it is only separated from it by the sands, which are here about 20 yards across. When the rains have been violent, the additional waters of the Tapado are discharged over the sands, and sometimes, at spring tides, when the wind blows fresh, a few waves will reach over them and fall into the dike, this being the only manner in which they can communicate with each other. At the Doce likewise landed Pedro Jacques de Magalhães, the general, and Brito Ferrer, now known as an historian. The admiral of the fleet which assisted the patriots of Pernambuco in the completion of their long-desired and hardly earned object, the reconquest of Recife and consequent expulsions of the Dutch. Footnote: History of Brazil, Volume 2, page 237. End footnote. But to return, I arrived upon the banks of the Doce and asked at a cottage, which was not far distant, if the river was fordable, and being answered in the affirmative, I rode up to its banks, and attempted to make my horse enter it, which he refused to do. I made a second and a third trial, when he plunged in, swimming. It was with much difficulty that he gained the outermost point of the sandbank on the opposite side. He had passed a bad night, and was not in a proper state to perform this task, nor should I have attempted it if I had known the depth, but I imagine that the tide had sufficiently retreated. My clothes were dry before I arrived at home, but I long felt the consequences of crossing the Doce. About the middle of May I removed to Jaguaribe. The road to it is through the plantation of Paulistas, from whence, after crossing the Paratibi, a narrow path leads to the left through a deep wood for nearly 1 league. A steep hill is to be surmounted, and its corresponding declivity carefully descended. The wood continues to a break in the hill, on the side nearest to Jaguaribe. On reaching the spot there was a view before me, which would in most situations be accounted very beautiful, but in this delightful country so many fine prospects are continually presenting themselves, that I opened upon this with few feelings of pleasure at the sight. I cannot avoid owning that the advantages of the place as a plantation occupied my mind more deeply than its beauties. Immediately before me was a cottage and a row of negro huts, surrounded by banana trees, standing up on a shelf of the hill. Beyond these, to the left, was the narrow but far extending valley, upon whose nearest border were situated the buildings of Jaguaribe, upon an open field, with the hills behind, and in front was the rivulet. To the right was a deep dell, with an expanse of country not thickly covered with wood, and rather in advance, but also to the right, were numerous deep-colored mangroves, which pointed out that a stream of considerable size ran down among them. On the other side of the nearest of these mangroves, and not yet very far, was the high peak of St. Bento, with the mandioc and maize lands, and wood upon its side, and the path winding up through them, which is at times concealed, and at times in view. But the buildings are not to be seen, though the tolling of the chapel bell may be often heard, from the spot upon which I was standing. I was under the necessity of taking up my abode in the vestry of the chapel, as the great house was still occupied. The negroes were already at work for us, and under the direction of a proper feitor, or manager. The whole neighborhood was astonished at the place I had determined to inhabit, until some other dwelling presented itself. I was certainly not comfortably situated, for the vestry consisted of only one apartment, with a doorway to the field, and another into the church, the latter being without a door. The church was unfinished, and was the resort of bats and owls. However, it was principally my unconcern respecting ghosts which my neighbors were surprised at. A negro boy and myself remained at night to encounter these, if any should appear, and to receive our constant visitors, the bats. My companion rolled himself up on the ground in a piece of baize and a mat, and thus cased was quite safe. I slept in a hammock, and oftentimes these unwelcome guests alighted upon it, as if they had come for the chance of a toe or a finger making its appearance, upon which they might fix. This way of living did not last long, nor did I wish that it should. The house of which I have spoken, as being situated upon a shelf of the hill, and as looking down upon the valley, was soon without an inhabitant, and therefore to this I removed. It was large, but the floors of the room were without bricks, and the interior walls had not been whitewashed for an age, and some of them had never undergone the operation. I received visits and presents, as is customary, from my immediate neighbors, the white persons and those of color who aspire to gentility, and indeed many individuals of the lower class did not neglect to come and offer their services to the newcomer, whose character and disposition towards them they judged that it was necessary to become acquainted with. In many instances the wives of the latter description of visitors came also and brought sweetmeats, fruit, or flowers. I received them all, sitting in my hammock. The men sat round on chairs, and the women generally squatted down upon the floor, though it was formed of earth. I talked to them of my intentions, and of my wish to conciliate, and I heard much of bickerings and squabblings among those of their rank, and of feuds between their superiors, these same stories being related to me in many different ways. They were much surprised that I should wear so much clothes, saying that I ought to do as they did, and be unencumbered, and their advice I soon followed. I was much amused, and for some days these visits took up the largest portion of my time. The lands around me to the north belonged to the Benedictine friars, and to the east to an old lady. Those of the latter were much neglected, but those which were possessed by the former were in high order. To the south, beyond the wood through which I passed in coming to Jaguaribe, are the lands of Paulistas, and to the west and northwest are some excellent cane lands, belonging to a religious lay brotherhood of free negroes of Olinda, which were tenanted by and subdivided among a great number of persons of low rank, whites, mulattoes, and blacks. The work went on regularly, and I had soon very little in which to employ my time, excepting those things by which I might think proper to amuse myself. In the beginning of June it was necessary that I should visit Guiana. However, I took a circuitous route for the purpose of seeing something new. I was accompanied by an old free man of color, and by Manuel, a faithful African. We slept the first night at Aguiar, the estate of the Capitan Mor with whom I travelled to Bon Jardim, and on the following morning proceeded through several sugar plantations. We rested at midday at Purgatorio, a small cotton and manioc plantation, but we could not purchase anything of which to make a dinner, and therefore, as was usual on such occasions, we smoked in place of eating. When the sun had declined a little, we again set forth. A few of the sugar plantations through which we passed in the afternoon were in a decayed state. We stopped at a cottage and begged the owner to sell us a fowl, but she refused. We had not eaten anything this day. I was loath so to do, but I could not avoid saying that she must sell one, that I did not mind the price, but that hunger would not allow me to let her do as she pleased in this case. She fixed upon one and made me pay exorbitantly for it. We parted in the end very good friends. She offered me some herbs with which to cook the bird, and after this reconciliation we again advanced. By going to Purgatorio we had left the usual direct road. Crossroads, even in England, are not good, so what must they be in Brazil? In one part we were obliged to lean down upon our horses' necks, and to proceed in this manner for some distance, with the branches of the trees completely closed above. The plantation of Mundo Novo, or the New World, which we reached late in the afternoon, was in ruins. Trees grew in the chapel, and the brushwood in front of the dwelling-house rose higher than its roof. I slept at a cottage hard by, which was inhabited by an elderly man and a number of children, large and small. The ill-fated fowl and another, which we had also obtained by the way, were dressed by the daughters of our host. Soon the cooking was effected, and I commenced operations, literally with tooth and nail, upon one of the birds, for there were no knives, forks, or spoons to be had. However, I did receive some assistance from my own faca de ponta, a pointed knife or dirk, which, though prohibited by law, is worn by all ranks of persons. At night my hammock was slung under the penthouse. At a late hour a shower of rain came on. Our host had a vast herd of goats. These crowded in from the rain, and soon I was obliged, in self-defense, to rise, as I discovered that they had very little respect for me. My head and some of theirs having come in contact, made me look out for better quarters. And these I found upon a high table, where I remained until the visitors again ventured forth. We proceeded on the morrow, and reached Guiana by the low marshy lands of Catu. The river was scarcely fordable, but we crossed, and on the opposite side the loose mud in the road reached above the horses' knees, and continued along it for more than 100 yards. We entered it, and the horses gently waded through, but mine unfortunately felt that his tail was not quite easy in the mud, and therefore began to move it to and fro on either side, and as it was long, much too long for this occasion, it struck me at every jerk. My dress was a light-colored nankeen jacket and trousers, and I came forth, without exaggeration, one cake of mud from head to foot. I rode to the residence of a person with whom I had been long acquainted. He had taken up his quarters in a new manioc plantation, which had been lately established in the outskirts of Guiana. My friend had removed to this place to superintend some of the workmen. I stayed only 2 days at Guiana, for I soon accomplished the object of my journey, which was to obtain 20 Indian laborers from Alhandra. My return to Jaguaribe was by the usual road. The day after my arrival at my new home I rode to Recife, and had on the following day an attack of ague. I had exposed myself lately too much to the sun, and had been several times wet through. The disorder left me in a fortnight. My horses were sent for. They came, and I set off for Jaguaribe, but in midway I was drenched with rain, and reaching that place much tired, went to sleep unintentionally in my hammock, without changing my clothes. In the morning I felt that the ague was returning, and therefore ordered my horse, and rode out to try to shake off the attack, which the peasants say it is possible to do. However, whilst I was talking with a neighbour on horseback at his door, the ague came on, and I was unable to return to my dwelling. The next day the Indians from Alhandra arrived. They had imbibed strange notions of the riches of an Englishman, and their captain told me that they knew I was very rich and could afford to give higher wages than anyone else. I tried to undeceive them in this respect, but all to no purpose. I offered the usual rate of labor in the country, but their characteristic obstinacy had entered into them, and they preferred returning as they came to any abatement of their first demand, although this was 25% higher than any person had ever been known to give for daily labor. They dined, placed their wallets upon their shoulders, and went away. One of my people said, as they disappeared, ascending the hill beyond the field, they had rather work for anyone else for half the money than lower in their demands to you. I was removed from this neighbor's house after a few days in a hammock, but finding that the disorder increased, I sent for my manager, an old man of color, whose wife attended upon me. By my desire he collected a sufficient number of bearers, as it was my wish to be carried to Recife. About 5 o'clock in the afternoon we set off. There were 16 men to bear the hammock by turns, and the manager was likewise in company. Of these persons only 2 were slaves. After we passed the wood, and had arrived upon a good road, the bearers proceeded at a long walk, approaching to a run. Their wild chorus, which they sung as they went along, their mischief in throwing stones at the dogs by the roadside, and in abuse, half joking, half wishing for an opportunity of quarrelling, confident in their numbers, and that as they were in the service of a white man, he would bring them out of any scrape, was very strange, and had I been less unwell, this journey would have much amused me. As we passed through Olinda, a woman asked my men if they carried a dead body, for it is in this manner they are brought from a distance for interment. One of the bearers answered, "No, it is the devil." Footnote: Señora, now, I o diabo. End footnote. And then turning to me, said, "Is it not so, my master?" Footnote: Que dis, meu amo? End footnote. I said yes, and the good woman walked away, saying, "Ave Maria, the Lord forbid." Footnote: Ave Maria, Nossa Señor nos livre. End footnote. The wind was high, and some rain fell as we crossed the Olinda sands. We arrived at Recife between 9 and 10 o'clock. The bearers stopped before we approached the gateway at the entrance of the town, that each man might, in some way or other, conceal his long unlawful knife. Without one of these weapons, no peasant or great man leaves his home, notwithstanding the prohibition. I became gradually worse, until my recovery was not expected, but the kind attentive hand of another Englishman here again was stretched forth. My former friend had left the country, but another supplied his place, and from him I received every brotherly kindness. I cannot forbear mentioning the following circumstances related to my illness. I went on board an English merchant ship some weeks after my recovery, and on passing a cask which was lying upon the deck, I struck it intentionally, but without any particular object. The master, who was an old gentleman with whom I had come from England, and who had been long acquainted with me, said, "Yes, you would not have liked it." I asked him what he meant, to which he replied, "It was for you, but you gave us the slip this time." I did not yet understand him, so he continued, "Why, do you think I would have let you remain among these fellows here, who would not have given you a Christian burial? I intended to have taken you home in that puncheon of rum." I was told by one of my medical attendants, when I was recovering, that some old maiden ladies, who lived near to where I resided, had frequently pressed him, whilst I was in a dangerous state, to have the sacrament brought to me, for they were much aggrieved that I should die without any chance of salvation. An English merchant of Recife asked my particular friend when the funeral was to take place, and one of the medical men wrote a note to the same person late one night, inquiring whether his attendance on the following morning had been rendered unnecessary. As soon as I was well enough to remove, I took a small cottage at the village of Monteiro, that I might have the advantage of better air than that of Recife, and yet not to be too far distant from medical advice. Here I passed my time very pleasantly in daily intercourse with a most worthy Irish family, of whom I shall always preserve recollections of gratitude for the kindness which I received at that time and on other occasions. On the night of my arrival at Montero, one of my pack-horses was stolen, but the animal was recognized some weeks afterwards by a boy who was in my service. The man into whose hands he had fallen happened to pass through the village, and thus I recovered my horse. It is astonishing to what a great extent horse-stealing has been carried. In a country which abounds so much with these animals, it is almost the only species of robbery, for the practising of which regular gangs of men have been discovered to have been formed. But these fellows will sometimes also chance to lay hold of a stray ox or cow. Footnote. These practices were, or rather are, carried on in one part of the country with which I am well acquainted. The persons who commit the crimes are white men and of high birth. Among them was a priest. The magistrate of the district in question was applied to by a man who had lost a cow, mentioning that he more than suspected where she was, and at the same time naming the place. A tropa, or a troop or party, of ordinanza soldiers were collected, and these men were dispatched to search the house, which had been pointed out under the command of a corporal of well-known courage. They arrived there and knocked. The door was opened by the owner, who was the priest connected with the gang. He said that he could not allow his house to be entered without an order from the ecclesiastical court. This answer was conveyed to the magistrate who had signed the order, the soldiers remaining round about the house. A second order arrived, and the bearer brought with him a couple of hatchets, thus expressly pointing out to the corporal what he was to do. Forthwith preparations were made for breaking open the door, when the priest said that he would allow the corporal to enter alone. The man fearlessly went in, but as soon as the door was again closed, the priest seized upon him, and some of the negroes who were in another apartment sprang forwards to assist their master. But the corporal disengaged himself, and standing upon the defensive, called to his men, who soon broke into the house. Search was made, and the carcass and hide of the cow were found, and were with the negroes taken publicly to the nearest town. The mark of the red-hot iron upon the haunch had been burnt out of the hide, that discovery might be rendered less easy. The priest was punished by suspension from saying Mass for a few months. I was subsequently acquainted with him. He was received by many persons as if nothing had been amiss, but he was not received as heretofore, for the individuals of his own profession would not, generally speaking, associate with him. The circumstance had not, however, so completely prevented his re-entrance into decent society, as such a crime would have done in many other countries, or so much as would have occurred at Pernambuco if he had been a layman. End footnote. I was most anxious to return to Jaguaribe, and about the middle of October was making preparations for the purpose, when the manager arrived from the plantation, with the intelligence that one of his assistants had been attacked 2 nights before, and nearly killed, by some persons who had been commissioned to perform this deed in revenge of some real or imagined injury which the man had committed. This determined my proceedings. The following morning I set off with the manager and a servant to see the wounded man. I found him at his father's house, in most woeful plight. His face was dreadfully lacerated, and his body much bruised. The deed had been done by bludgeons, and evidently in fear, else the task would have been performed less clumsily and more effectually. I never could discover by whom the murder was intended, nor the persons who attempted it. They were dressed in leather, like sertanejos, but the sufferer imagined that this costume was made use of as a disguise. 2 men sprang out upon him in a narrow lane which had high banks on each side. He defended himself for some time with his sword, but they overpowered him at last, and his weapon was the only part of his property which they carried off. I removed altogether from Montero in a few days. My presence had long been necessary at Jaguaribe, for the mill was at work, and as frequently happens in every country, some of the persons who were employed had not remained empty-handed, The poor fellow who had been waylaid soon returned to the plantation. He told me that every night large stones were thrown violently against his door, between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning. I called the manager the following evening, and both of us being armed, we took our station near to the gate which leads into the field, one being on each side, behind the high bank. We could hear the footsteps of any person long before he could approach us, as the splashing in the rivulet, which runs beyond the gate, would give us timely notice. The mosquitoes gave us much employment. However, we remained at our post until half an hour before daybreak, without seeing anything, but the practice was discontinued. 2 men had arrived early in the night to offer themselves as laborers. They were awake when we returned, had made a good fire upon the ground in the mill, a spacious roof supported upon brick pillars, and were sitting round it upon their heels. We joined them, and here I heard the stories of their own prowess, of charms and miracles, and other conversation of the same nature, each of them telling something strange which he had seen or heard. Footnote: a free negro, with whom I had been acquainted whilst I resided at this place, and who came to see me when I removed to Itamarasa, told me, with much horror pictured in his countenance, of the fate of a man who had worked for me. He said that this person occasionally became a lobos homem, a wolf-man. I asked him to explain, when he said that the man was at times transformed into an animal of the size of a calf, with the figure of a dog, that he left his home at midnight in this metamorphosed state, and ran about with the violence of a mad dog, and that he attacked anyone whom he might chance to meet. The black man was perfectly persuaded of the correctness of his own statement, when he related, having, with his brother-in-law and his sister, met this uncommon beast near to their own cottages. I suppose it was some large dog which prowled about to satisfy his hunger in the neighborhood of these habitations. But no, the man was persuaded that it was poor Miguel. End footnote. End of section 16. Section 17 of Travels in Brazil, Volume 1 by Henry Koster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Part 2. Much time had been lost, and the cane ought to have been planted for the crop of the following year. The negroes in my possession could not perform what ought to be done in proper time, and therefore I collected free laborers for the purpose, and in a short period between 30 and 40 men, some of whom brought their families, removed onto the lands of the plantation, and most of them erected hovels of palm leaves in which they dwelt, but a few of them were accommodated with huts of mud. They were Indians, mulattoes, free negroes, and slaves working together, a motley crew. I had now taken up my abode at the house, which was usually inhabited by the owner or tenant. This was a low but long mud cottage, covered with tiles and whitewashed within and without. It had brick floors, but no ceiling. There were 2 apartments of tolerable dimensions, several small rooms, and a kitchen. The chief entrance was from a sort of square, formed by the several buildings belonging to the estate. In front was the chapel. To the left was a large dwelling-house unfinished, and the negro huts, a long row of small habitations, having much the appearance of almshouses, without the neatness of places of this description in England. To the right was the mill worked by water, and the warehouse or barn in which the sugar undergoes the process of claying, and to the view of these buildings may be added the pens for the cattle, the carts, heaps of timber, and a small pond through which the water runs to the mill. At the back of the house was the large open field, the mill dam beyond, and cottages, mandiac lands, and trees along the valley, bordered on each side by steep hills covered with thick woods. Oftentimes I have sat at night upon the threshold of the door, after all my people had retired to their habitations. They have supposed that I was asleep. Then I have heard the whisperings in the negro huts, and have observed some one leaving his house and steal away to visit an acquaintance residing at some distance. Or there has been some clandestine feast or merrymaking, thus late at night. Neighboring negroes have been invited, and have crept in during the evening unperceived. It is on these occasions that plans for deceiving the master are contrived. In these sweet unpermitted meetings, the schemes are formed. Then the slave owner, who is aware of such secret practices, and reflects, must feel of how little avail are all his regulations, all his good management. Restraint creates the wish to act contrary to given rules. The slave has a natural bias to deceive him who holds him in subjugation. A man may love the master whom he may at pleasure leave, but to be tied down, and as a duty enjoined to esteem, fails not in most instances to rouse contrary feelings, to awaken a sense of pleasure rather than of pain, in counteracting the wishes and in rendering nugatory the determinations of him who commands. At other times, far distant ideas from these have occupied my mind. I thought of the strange life I was leading. A remembrance of feudal times in Europe has crossed me, and I could not forbear comparing with them the present state of the interior of Brazil. The great power of the planter, not only over his slaves, but his authority over the free persons of lower rank, the respect which is required by these barons from the free inhabitants of their lands. Footnote: on Saturdays only, throughout the country, are cattle slaughtered, and thus weekly many persons of each neighborhood assemble, as much to converse and hear the news as to purchase their portion of meat. On one of these occasions a young man of color was stooping to arrange upon the end of his walking stick the meat which he had bought. At the moment that a person of considerable power was riding up, the man of importance, when he came near to the young mulatto, struck him with a long cane with which he rode, saying, "Why don't you take off your hat when a white man appears?" The blow was felt severely, and still more severely answered. The man of color drew his knife, and quickly turning round, ran it hilt deep into the groin of him by whom he had been insulted. And then, with the bloody knife in his hand, he ran off, vowing destruction upon anyone who touched him. The rich man had only time, before he died, to direct that the murderer should not be pursued, owing that his own impetuous tyranny had deservedly produced this catastrophe. The young man returned in a few weeks to his former home, and was not molested by the relatives of him whom he had murdered, nor did the law take cognizance of the deed. End footnote. The assistance which they expect from their tenants in case of insult from a neighboring equal, the dependence of the peasants, and their wish to be under the peculiar protection of a person of wealth who is capable of relieving them from any oppression, and of speaking in their behalf to the governor, or to the chief judge. All these circumstances combined tend to render the similarity very great. I even felt the power which had unintentionally fallen into my hands. I had collected a considerable number of free workmen, and the estate was respected for miles round. Many of these fellows would have committed almost any crime under the impression that my protection would screen them, and if I had not turned some away, and threatened others that I would aid the law rather than evade it, should their proceedings be irregular, I know not what evil deeds might not have followed. Footnote: the following anecdote exemplifies the feudal state of the planters a few years since. It was related to me by a gentleman upon whose veracity I have every reason to rely. Some 15 years ago, the governor of Pernambuco sent for a sergeant of the only regiment of the line which existed at that time, whose courage was well known and much dreaded. He received orders from the governor to proceed with all expedition possible to the sugar plantation of Manjope, distant from Recife 4 leagues, for the purpose of taking the owner of that place into custody. Or, if he found that his apprehension alive was impracticable, he was then to bring his head to the governor. The sergeant was desired to pick out as many soldiers as he thought fit to accompany him, but he said that he should go alone, and consequently the following morning he set forth. On his arrival at Manjope, he was received by the owner of the plantation, who was a colonel of militia, or a Capitan Mor. Being seated, he quietly made his errand known, showing to the great man the order for his apprehension, and mentioning the additional instructions in case of disobedience. The colonel left the room, but soon returned with a bag containing about the value of 100 pounds in gold coins, and presented this to the sergeant, who told him to return, and tell the governor that he would visit him as soon as possible, and explain to him the circumstances which had given rise to this mission. The sergeant took the money, and set out on his return, and by the way bought a sheep, killed it, and then cutting off its head, put this into a bag. On arriving at the palace, he placed his bloody burthen upon the ground, and pointing to it, said to the governor, "I've executed your commands." He would not come, and therefore I brought his head. The governor, all amazement, answered, "And have you really killed the colonel of Manjope?" The sergeant replied, "I've only acted according to the orders which I received." The following morning, what was the astonishment of the governor to hear that the colonel of Manjope was in waiting, and wished to see him. He gave him an audience, matters were explained, and they parted good friends. The sergeant was sent for after the departure of the colonel, and on being questioned, told the whole story, and showed the bag of money. The governor was displeased, but at the same time ashamed of the rash orders which he had given. The sergeant was, however, too useful a man to be in disgrace. Whilst I was unwell at Recife and Monteiro, the manager and his wife had taken possession of the house, and here they remained for some time after my return. Thus I lived literally among the people. I had indeed my meals alone, but generally 2 or 3 of the persons employed upon the plantation were in this room whilst I breakfasted or dined, and they stood or sat talking to me. Any one reached me a plate, or aught else for which I asked, if he happened to be near to what I wanted. The manager and his wife told me many strange tales. He was a man of feudal stamp, honest and faithful in every respect, from personal regard to the man whom he served, but not in general to the world, not from a principle of right and wrong. This is very frequently the case among these people. He was, however, of the right sort for what I wanted, and if I was again to travel there, I should seek him out. I had become somewhat intimate in several families of the neighbourhood, but was the most amused with my acquaintance in those of secondary rank, where there is less ceremony than among persons of the first class. In the former, the females often appear, when the visitor is a neighbour, has concerns with the master of the house, and becomes intimate with him. The festival of St. Bento was to be celebrated about the close of the year in the adjoining plantation, belonging to the monks of whom he is the patron saint. The convent is at Olinda, and there the abbot resides. The fraternity is rich, possessing much landed property. Upon the estate adjoining to Jaguaribe, mandioc, maize, rice, and other articles of food are cultivated, with which the convent is supplied. The slaves upon it are in number about 100, of all ages, and the last African died whilst I resided in that part of the country. The festival at which I intended to be present was that of Our Lady of the Rosary, the patroness of negroes. The expense which was to be incurred was subscribed for by the slaves of the estate, and the festival was entirely managed by them. 3 friars attended to officiate at the altar, but the lights, the fireworks, and all other necessary articles were provided for by a committee of the slaves. The manager of the estate was a mulatto slave, who made a visit upon my arrival at Jaguaribe, and on the occasion of the festival came to invite me to the novena and to the festa, the 9 previous evenings and the festival. Or rather, he came to request that I would not fail to go, as he feared that my people and his might quarrel. I went with a large party of men and women. We ascended the hill, and on our arrival at its summit, I was invited by one of the black women to enter her cottage, the same invitation being made to several other persons of our party. The chapel is placed quite upon the highest point of the hill, and the house in which the friars dwell, when they come to the estate, and the row of negro huts, form a semicircle about it, thus in part enclosing the chapel. These habitations look down upon the broad river of Maria Farinha, winding below among the mangroves, and there are several creeks on the opposite side, which look like so many branches. The crowd which had assembled was considerable, and was not a little increased by my free workmen, some of whom were unmarried men, unencumbered and ready for any mischief. I was armed with a long pike and a large knife of the country, and had brought 3 of my slaves, accoutred much in the same manner. 3 resolute Africans, upon whom I could depend, and whose business it was closely to watch their master. Before the commencement of the prayers and singing in the chapel, the black people extended several mats upon the ground in the open air, and our party sat down upon them to converse and to eat cakes and sweetmeats, of which many kinds were exposed for sale in great abundance. All went on quietly for 3 nights, for the mulatto manager forbade the sale of rum, but on the 4th night some liquor unfortunately found its way up the hill, and Nicolau, the manager, came in haste to inform me that a few of my Indians were earnestly bent on quarrelling with a party of his people. I rose from the mat upon which I had been seated, and, followed by my bodyguard, accompanied him back to the spot, where I soon saw that a fight had commenced. Persuasion was of no avail, and therefore my negroes made use of the butt end of their pikes, and brought an Indian to the ground, who was delivered over to Simon, one of my fellows, and I desired the 2 slaves who remained to assist the Saint Bento negroes. I thus proved that I would not uphold my own people if they acted irregularly, and the matter fortunately ended with only some trifling bruises and 1 broken head. The Indian was conveyed home by Simon, who returned to tell me that he had placed the man in the stocks, with the intent of sobering him. No more quarrels were entered into, for this affair quite sickened all those who might have been so inclined. In the morning the Indian was set at liberty, and he quietly went off to his work, not being much the worse. I had great pleasure in witnessing the most excellent arrangements of this plantation. The negroes are as happy as persons in a state of slavery can be, but although the tasks are, comparatively speaking, easy, and corporal punishments are only resorted to for children, still the great object at which they aim is to be free, and to purchase the freedom of their children. Footnote: Slaves are permitted to purchase their own freedom, or tendering to the master the sum of money which he originally gave for them. But I shall presently speak more at large of this law and of slavery as it exists in Brazil. End footnote. One man, who was a fisherman by trade, had obtained the manumission of his wife, though he was still a slave himself, with the intent that if he should still have any more children, they might be free, and he purposed afterwards purchasing his own freedom and that of the young ones. Several instances of the same behavior frequently occurs upon the estates belonging to these and other friars. Thus everyone wishes to be a free agent, and it is this feeling alone which makes a Saint Bento negro do all in his power to be able to act for himself, for very probably he may be obliged to labor with more diligence to obtain his living as a free man than as a slave. The emancipated negro oftentimes becomes an excellent member of society, for he contracts habits of industry, in which he continues. But again, if he has been hardly treated by a rigorous master, he becomes disgusted with and indifferent to life, is rendered callous to shame, and drags on in an idle, miserable existence. Another festival was to take place at one of the chapels upon the coast, which is dedicated to Our Lady of the Conception. This was distant 1.5 leagues from Jaguaribe. However, we formed a party, and mounted our horses one moonlight evening, the females riding behind their husbands and relations, with a sheet or counterpane thrown over the horses' haunches, upon which they sat. We came out upon the seashore at the church of Our Lady of the O, of which I shall presently speak, not far from the fort of Pau Amarillo, and from thence proceeding along the sands to the place of our destination. I was introduced to the family of an old Portuguese who resided there. His son had just taken orders as a secular priest, and was to say his first mass on the day of the festival. There were puppet shows, tumblers, and all their attendants in great abundance, fireworks and bonfires, noise, bustle, and no lack of quarrelling. Within the chapel there was a display of wax tapers, praying, singing, and music, as is usual. The assemblage of persons was very considerable. Indeed, wherever the surf is not violent, the seashore is well peopled, along the whole extent of coast between Olinda and the bar of the river Guayana. In many parts the low straw huts are united, or nearly so, in long rows together. Whitewashed cottages with tiled roofs are frequently interspersed. Churches and chapels have been built, and few intervals of much extent remain unpeopled, The lands are planted with the cocoa trees, which is the most profitable plant of Brazil. The cocoa tree appears to be adapted to the sandy soil of the coast, upon which only very few others will vegetate. Here it flourishes, and seems to derive nourishment from its vicinity to the sea. But when it is situated in rich land, the cocoa tree droops, and even upon the sandy plains of the interior it does not bear its fruit with the same luxuriance, or reach that height which it attains when exposed to the sea breeze. These cocoa groves, through which the eye can reach for miles, with the hovels composed entirely of the leaves of these trees spread among them, form in some parts very picturesque views, and if, as frequently occurs, the cottage is situated upon the border of a wood, just where the cocoas end, and the dark green foliage of the forest trees is seen behind, then the view is even romantic, and if the wind is high, the rustling of the cocoa trees and the dashing of the waves increases much the wildness of the scene. However, to return, as soon as the church service was ended, we mounted our horses and rode back to Our Lady of the O. We alighted at a cottage which stood near to the church, the inhabitants of which were acquainted with some of our party. The moon was bright, and the breeze moderate. We sat down upon mats before the door, and were regaled with quantities of young cocoa nuts, a most delightful fruit when they are in this state. Some of us walked down toward the beach. The tide was out, and I observed several large blocks of hewn stone, partly buried in the sand, below high water mark. I inquired what had caused them to be there, and was answered that a church had formerly stood upon that spot, and I heard then, and afterwards often saw, that the sea was making considerable encroachments along the coast, to the distance of half a league or more each way. The new church of Our Lady of the O was now building at a distance of about 300 yards from the shore. Strange tales are told of the miraculous deeds of this lady. When the church was about to be rebuilt, many of the landholders of the neighborhood were desirous of having the edifice upon their ground. This proceeded from a religious feeling. Lots were drawn to determine upon the site of the new church, and although manifestly inconvenient from many causes, it has been erected upon the spot where it now stands, because the same lot was drawn 3 times. A very great objection, and one which in common cases would have been insurmountable, is that this is the lowest piece of land in the neighborhood, and is opposite to the place upon which the sea is making the most rapid advances. Water, too, for mixing the lime and sand, must have been conveyed from a considerable distance, but a spring of it gushed forth at the moment that one of the laborers was making preparations for the commencement of his work. And since the Capella Mor, or principal chapel, has been built, all kinds of diseases are said to be cured. The fame of this most powerful lady has reached far and wide, and from the interior to the distance of 150 leagues, persons who were afflicted with disorders which have been considered incurable by human means have come down to make their offerings to this avaricious personage, whose powerful intercession is not to be obtained unless she is in return well paid for her trouble. Footnote: in Old Portuguese, whose faith in the intercession of saints could not be very strong, being asked for alms to assist in the decoration of an image, refused to give anything, and added, "The saints are in a much better situation than I am. They don't want any assistance from me." End footnote. As the road from the Sertão to the seashore was by Jaguaribe, I saw many of the travelers. I conversed with many wealthy persons whose sole errand was to offer part of their possessions, upon condition of relief from the malady under which they suffered. The patrimony of this church is now considerable, from the numerous donations which have been made. Some of these have been advanced on credit, the donors being fully confident of repayment in the manner which they desire. Others have been made in consequence of the persons who gave them having been really cured. Faith has done what medicine could not. Such has been the reliance upon the efficacy of the prayers which were offered up, and upon the power of the lady, that the probability of disappointment has never occurred to them. And when the disorder proceeds more from the imagination than from the body, I should suppose that a cure may be effected, much in the same manner that in other countries cures are said to be performed by medicinal waters, of which, although the qualities may be very excellent, yet the name may surpass the reality in bringing about the desired end. The miracles of Our Lady of the O are performed in 3 ways: by prayer from the patient, by drinking the water of the spring, or by application of some of it to the part affected, and by eating or outwardly applying a small quantity of the salt which oozes from the wall against which the high altar stands. Footnote: I insert the following passage from number 32 of Dr. Thomson's Annals of Philosophy, page 138. It is given for the purpose of acquainting the supporters of Our Lady of the O that the salt oozes from walls in an heretical as well as in a Catholic country. The formation of nitre upon calcareous stones in certain situations has been long known. An advantage has been taken of it to procure that important salt in great quantities, though no satisfactory theory of the formation of the salt itself has yet been offered to the public. The present paper contains a set of observations on the appearance of an efflorescence of saltpetre on the walls of the Ashmole Laboratory at Oxford, a large ground room sunk below the area of the street. The walls are built of Oxford limestone, a granular floats limestone containing many fragments of shells of vegetable bodies, and composed of 96 carbonate of lime and 4 of ochre sand. The salt form was nearly pure, though it contained traces of lime and of sulphuric and muriatic acids. What was formed in winter contained most lime. The formation of the salt was most rapid in frosty weather. It formed slowly, and the quantity even diminished in moist weather after it had been deposited. Exclusion from the air did not preclude the deposition of the salt, though it diminished it considerably. Page 70. The paper which the above is an analysis is by John Kidd, M.D., Professor of Chemistry in Oxford. End footnote. A village has risen around the church, composed of huts for the sick, who have journeyed far from other districts. The business has completely succeeded. The money which was required for rebuilding the church has been obtained, and when I came away the concern was going on prosperously. I heard the remark made by some firm believers that such was the sinfulness of the inhabitants of the vicinity, that the lady had scarcely vouchsafed to perform any cures upon them. The wonderful stories of cures were always of persons who lived in remote districts. But I did meet with a few cases in which fancied illness from lowness of spirits was removed. The general credulity of the lower orders of people, and even of many individuals of the higher ranks, is beyond all belief. No persuasion, no reasoning is of any service. Even a doubt of the truth of every story which told is not admitted. Footnote: Some time ago a wooden figure was brought up out of the sea in a fisherman's net. It was deposited in a place of safety, and was, on inspection, by some person who was judged competent to decide upon the subject, declared to be an image of St. Luke. It was removed to a church, and has taken its place as a representative of that saint. Now I have it whispered that this said St. Luke is no more than the figurehead of some unfortunate vessel which had been cast away, or that the figure had been broken off by a violent wave. End footnote. From hence we proceeded to pay another visit. The owner of this cottage had no cocoas to offer, but he would have dressed some fish, and he gave us some wild fruits. The sale of a jangada was extended for us, and we laid down for some time to converse. At a late hour we set off homewards, and from carelessness lost our way. We wandered through the paths of the woods of Maranhão until we judged, rightly as it happened, that we were in the road which would lead us to Jaguaribe. There was much merriment, notwithstanding the disaster, for we knew that daylight would end our difficulties, and it was now past 2 o'clock. The mill was continually at work. I usually took the first watch, and superintended the business until midnight. Several of my neighbors and their families came to amuse themselves in conversation, and others came for the purpose of eating sugar-cane, of which everyone who has tasted must be fond. About this time died in childbed a female slave who was generally regretted. She was a good servant and an excellent wife and mother. The grief of her husband bore much the appearance of insanity. He would not eat until the following day, and then he only tasted food from the persuasion of one of his children. Until the time of my departure from Pernambuco, he had not recovered his former spirits. And he never spoke of his wife without tears in his eyes. Even some of the other slaves were for a few days after her death unsettled. The rude instruments upon which they were in the habit of playing in the evening at their doors were laid aside. All merriment was discontinued for some time. I was requested about this period to be bridesman at the marriage of a mulatto couple. I agreed, and on the day appointed set forth for TriciaG, accompanied by a free servant and a slave on horseback. I arrived about 10 o'clock, and found a large party of people of color assembled. The priest soon arrived, and he too was of the same caste. Breakfast of meat and piram, a paste made of farinha, was placed upon the table. Some part of the company sat down and ate, others stood doing the same, and others again, as if they were afraid of losing a minute's conversation, continued to talk loudly and without ceasing. I've witnessed few such scenes of confusion. At last we proceeded to the church, to which I was begged to be permitted to ride, for the distance was considerable, and I was somewhat lame from an accident. As soon as the ceremony was over, we returned to the house. The bride was of a dark brown color, for her father was a Negro, and her mother of mixed blood. She was dressed in a rose-colored silk gown, and a black veil was thrown over her head and shoulders. She wore white shoes and white stockings with open clocks. The bridegroom was also of dark color. He wore a coat of brown cloth, a waistcoat of brocaded silk, and nankeen pantaloons. He had on shoes with large buckles and a cocked hat. Both of these persons were young, and they seemed to be dreadfully hampered by the increased stock of apparel which they carried. The scene at dinner was a counterpart of the breakfast affair, with the addition of more noise and more confusion, which was caused by a larger assemblage of people and more plentiful draughts of wine and rum. I escaped as soon as possible, but would not on any account have missed being present at this day's work. On the night of Christmas Eve I did not go to bed, for we were to hear the Missa do Gallo, or cock mass, as is customary. The priest arrived, and the night was spent merrily. This person did not at that time come regularly as a chaplain, but he was so engaged afterwards. End of section 17. Section 18 of Travels in Brazil, Volume 1, by Henry Koster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Journey to Uninha. Continuation of my residence at Jaguaribe. Negro Brotherhood of Olinda. Blessing the Sugar Works. Mandingueiros and Valentões. About the middle of January 1813, I went to stay for some days at the cottage of an acquaintance who resided upon the plain of Barbalho, for the purpose of purchasing a few horses. This place is near to the village of Monteiro, but it is on the opposite side of the river. Barbalho is a plain of some extent, upon which cattle are turned out to feed. The soil of it is a stiff dark-colored clay, and the grass which grows upon it is of a coarse species. This becomes quite dry during the summer months, and when in this state it is set on fire, that the tender shoots which again spring up may serve as food for the animals that are to graze upon it. The fire will run along the ground, urged by a fresh breeze, will sometimes contract, and at others spread each way, presenting to the beholders a fiery wall. The sight is grand. It is upon a grand scale, which gives it a terrific appearance. The inhabitants of the skirts of this plain carefully preserve a circle around their houses and gardens, clear of vegetation. Apprehensive of some inconsiderate traveler who may chance to light his pipe as he goes along, and throw away unextinguished the fire-stick of which he has made use. The person with whom I was staying persuaded me to ride with him to the sugar plantation of Uninha, which is distant 6 leagues to the southward of Barbalho. He described the place as being very beautiful, and I consented. This was the only opportunity which conveniently offered itself of seeing the country in this direction, but I much regret not having made greater exertions to visit the southern districts of Pernambuco. We passed through the hamlet and by the parish church of the Varzea. A considerable extent of country is known under this name, containing some of the finest cane lands of the province, which are owned by men of wealth who know the value of what they possess, and consequently the plantations are in a flourishing condition. The Varzea is famous in Pernambucan history as the site of a great deal of fighting. Camaragibe, which is in the vicinity, or rather a part of the Varzea, and is spoken of by the historian of that country, is now a flourishing sugar plantation. Footnote: I am not certain of the situation of the Monte das Tabocas, where one of the chief battles was fought between the Portuguese and the Dutch in 1645. History of Brazil, Volume 2, page 108. There is now a plantation called Tabocas, which is owned by one of the chiefs of the Cavalcante family, but as I was acquainted with him and several other persons of the same description, I think the circumstance would have been mentioned if this had been the place. End footnote. We reached the sugar plantation of Camaçari, belonging to the Carmelite friars. It is in high order, that is, the slaves and cattle are in good condition, and everything upon it appeared cheerful. But it does not yield so much produce as it might if the strength of the laborers was pushed to the utmost. I looked into the mill, which is turned by water, and saw some handsome mulatto girls feeding the mill with cane. They were dressed in petticoats of printed cotton and smocks of cambric muslin, and they wore upon their necks and in their ears gold ornaments. They were singing in parts very tolerably. The difference between the plantations which belong to convents and those which are possessed by individuals who reside upon them, and have a direct interest in every trifling increase or decrease of the gains, is very striking. The estates of friars are worked almost exclusively by negroes who have been born upon them. Everything goes on easily and regularly. If much is made, the better satisfied is the chief for the time being. But if, on the contrary, little is obtained, still the affairs of the community go on. We proceeded, and at some distance beyond, descended from a high hill into a narrow valley, which was completely embosomed by the eminences around, and so enclosed that we appeared to intrude upon its inhabitants in crossing the spot of their retirement. The grass upon the hills was dry, but all below was yet in full health. At length we arrived at the plantation of Oninha, which is situated upon an extensive field, composed of uneven ground and watered by several springs. The mill is turned by oxen, which is a late improvement, horses being usually employed where water cannot be obtained. We dined with the owner, and he returned with us to Barballo in the afternoon. I was much delighted with the day's amusement. This was the most beautiful part of the country which I visited, taken as a whole. The hills and valleys are not high or extensive, but they are decidedly marked. Here cultivation formed a considerable feature in the country. The cane lands were extensive, and the mills for its manufacture into sugar numerous. On my return from Oninha, I wished still to remain at Barballo for a few days, and therefore the owner of the cottage at which I was staying went on to Jaguaribe, to remain there until I could join him. I stayed with Manuel and Simão. One morning Manuel had gone to cut a bundle of grass, and on his return met with an old acquaintance, a Creole negro. They quarrelled by the way, and as they came near to where I resided, the matter became serious, and blows were given and received, both of the men being armed with long poles. Simão saw this, took up a drawn sword which was lying upon a chair, and ran out to assist his comrade. I went out to put a stop to the business, and discovered that Simão had cut an enormous gash in the fellow's head. The man was brought into the cottage, and his wound was dressed. An acquaintance of mine happened now to come in, and he took charge of the negro and carried him home to his master. The negro was taking a load of grass for the horses of the governor, who resided at Monteiro, which is within half a mile of the site of these transactions. Notice would have been taken of the affair immediately, owing to the circumstances of the negro being employed for the governor, if His Excellency had not been informed that the offending negroes, for such I consider mine to have been, belonged to an Englishman, upon which no more inquiry was made, and as it was discovered that the master had nothing to do with the affray, no cognizance was taken of the matter by the military power. If the owner of the wounded slave had chosen so to do, he might have put me to much expense and trouble, for he might have accused my negroes of assaulting his. But the law of itself seldom does anything. Even in cases of murder, the prosecutor or accuser, as he is called, has it at his option to bring on the trial or not. If he can be bribed or otherwise persuaded to give up the accusation, the matter drops to the ground. Thus the spirit of law is changed from the principle of bringing an offender to justice for the general good of society, to that of prosecuting in revenge for the crime which he has committed against an individual. Soon after my return to Jaguaribe, I was one evening surprised at the arrival of a white man, who was habited in uniform of blue and red, and accompanied by a great number of loaded horses, and of men who were dressed in leather, after the manner of the Sertão. He delivered me a letter, which I discovered not to be for me, but for an Englishman who was occasionally with me. However, I of course requested him to stay, and gave directions for the accommodation of his followers. He was a commandant from the interior, distant 130 leagues, in the back settlements of the province of Paraíba, at the foot of the Serra do Teixeira. He had put on board of jangadas at Paraíba a considerable quantity of cotton, which he had brought down from his estate, and he was now travelling to Recife for the purpose of receiving it, and of purchasing necessaries, or rather luxuries, for his family, to which he appeared to be extremely attached. We soon became intimate, and when he proceeded to Recife at the close of a few days, he left some of his men and horses at Jaguaribe. It is among the inhabitants of places so remote as the district from which he came that clanship more particularly exists. He had with him 10 persons, most of whom were his compadres, that is, the commandant was sponsor to one of the children of each. This relationship is accounted very sacred in Brazil, and I believe in all Roman Catholic countries. It is a bond of brotherhood which permits the poor man to speak to his superior with a kind of endearing familiarity, and unites them in links of union, of which the non-observance would be sacrilegious. The commandant made me several visits from Recife, and after a delay of 2 months he set off on his return homewards. He was a man of most determined spirit, whose name is respected all over the part of the country which he inhabits, and this respect was produced by his wealth and individual character, which brooks no insult. And yet there was a natural goodness in his nature, which broke forth very strongly when he showed me the letters which he had received from his children, each of them, even to the youngest, having written to him. He had lately lost his wife. His manner of speaking of her was most affectionate. He told me that he had some intention of taking orders as a secular priest. Soon after the commandant left me, the following occurrence took place hard by, which is characteristic of the state of the country, and similar to what frequently happens, although this of what I am about to speak might have been avoided if the actors in it had been a little older and a little less hot-headed. A young man who resided in this neighborhood had been lately appointed to hold a military situation in the district, of which he was proud, and owing to which he had assumed an additional degree of personal importance. He possessed a high-spirited horse, and would sometimes turn him loose, although he had no fenced field into which he could put him. The animal soon found out the cane land of an adjoining estate, and destroyed considerably the young plants. From hence he would open the gate of the field, which, from the manner that the gates of plantations are usually made, was very easy for him to do, and would come and offer battle to some of the hard-worked horses. This was often repeated, notwithstanding that the animal had been caught each time, and sent home with a request that this might not again occur. However, at last one of the beasts of the estate was lamed by the horse, and rendered unfit for service, at least for some time. The owner was much vexed, and as one of his slaves was about to carry a message to some distance, he told him to ride the officer's horse. He went, and the owner was informed of this. He waylaid the slave and took the horse from him. The planter heard the next day that the officer had expressed to many persons a wish to meet him. However, no notice was taken of this. As he rode on the following morning to see his workmen, he saw the captain in the path on horseback talking to a mulatto man. The planter spoke to him, saying that he wished to pass, which he could not do unless he moved, and mentioning at the same time that he was informed of his wish to see him. The captain spurred his horse toward his adversary, attempting at the same moment to draw his sword, but this he did not do with ease, from some entanglement of the belt. The other man drew his, which was enclosed in a walking stick, and rode up to him, putting the point close to his breast, thus showing him how easily he might, by this unforeseen advantage, have taken his life. The mulatto man had now recovered from his astonishment, and ran in between the horses, striking them and driving them asunder. They still remained for some minutes in high words, but the captain had not, as was afterwards well known, supposed that the other was armed, and therefore his ardor for the combat had now cooled considerably. The Indians who were in my service occasionally requested leave to dance in front of my dwelling. I usually complied, and was often much amused. A large fire was made, that we might the better see what was going on, and that the evening might be rendered more entertaining. I frequently invited some of my neighbors. The dance commenced by two men stepping forward, and walking round and round, taking a circuit of a few yards, one of them singing, or rather reciting, in a low voice, some ditty of his own language, and the other playing upon a shrill pipe, and as they went on at intervals they gave a hop or a skip. Soon a woman joined them, and walked after them, and then another man came forward, and so forth, until a large ring was formed, and the pace was quickened. It was always expected that some liquor should be prepared for them, and each of these persons, as they felt inclined to take any of it, stepped out of the ring, and returned again as soon as they had drank. They continued dancing as long as any rum was produced, the women as well as the men relishing this, their means of inspiration. For as the quantities were increased, some new song was introduced. The tones became louder, and their articulation more rapid. The free people of color, too, would sometimes dance, but they only asked permission of me, and held their merrymaking at the door of one of their own huts. Their dances were like those of the African negroes. A ring was formed, the guitar player sat down in a corner, and began a simple tune, which was accompanied by some favorite song, of which the burthen was often repeated, and frequently some of the verses were extempore, and contained indecent allusions. One man stepped out into the center of the ring, and danced for some minutes, making use of lascivious attitudes until he singled out a woman, who then came forward and took her turn in movements not less indecent, and thus the amusement continued sometimes until daybreak. The slaves would also request to be permitted to dance. Their musical instruments are extremely rude. One of them is a sort of drum which is formed of a sheepskin stretched over a piece of the hollow trunk of a tree, and another is a large bow with one string, having half of a coconut shell or of a small gourd strung upon it. This is placed against the abdomen, and the string is struck with a finger or with a small bit of wood. When two holidays followed each other uninterruptedly, the slaves would continue their noise until daybreak. I have now to enter upon an affair which gave me much trouble. The lands belonging to the Negro Brotherhood of Olinda were very conveniently situated for Jaguaribe and for another plantation not far distant, which was owned by an old man of color, who harbored around him a numerous clan of relations and dependents. It was arranged that we should rent these lands equally, but to prevent competition, one of us only was to apply for them, and then they were to be divided. The owner of the plantation in question was to make the application, and I rested satisfied. But I was surprised to discover that I ran much risk of remaining without any part of them. Therefore I began to make arrangements for obtaining them for myself. Whilst the matter was yet in doubt, a person who was under the protection of the rival plantation sent a number of negroes to work upon some land which lay very near to Jaguaribe. I sent a message to the owner of these men, purporting that the land was tenanted by a person of my acquaintance, who yearly rented it from the Brotherhood, and therefore I requested him to direct that his slaves should retire. This he refused to do. Consequently, I collected a number of my free workmen and rode toward the spot in question. The matter had become serious, and as he was aware that if a scuffle ensued he might lose the service of a slave, whilst I, who was accompanied by freemen, would not sustain any loss, he gave the desired directions, and I returned home. I gained my object of renting the lands through the interest of some persons who were intimately acquainted with the principal officers of the Brotherhood. I attended at the council table of these black directors, and heard the arguments for and against the policy of placing the whole of the property in the hands of one person. However, the matter was decided as soon as one of them rose up, and reminded the rest that the community was in debt, and that the new tenant was prepared with 1 year's rent in advance. All objection was silenced by this speech, and the papers were signed without any farther remark. The black gentleman came down to Jaguaribe to put me in possession of the lands. I had invited several of my friends on this occasion, and blacks and whites all sat down and ate together. The health of Our Lady of the Rosary was drank first, then that of the chief of the Brotherhood and of the new tenant. These fellows amused us much, for their politeness to each other and to the white persons who were present sat awkwardly upon them, but was displayed to show the importance which they imagined themselves to possess. The Juiz, or chief of the Brotherhood, was a shoemaker at Olinda, and the rest were of the same rank in life, more or less. Possession was given me, and everything unpleasant seemed to have subsided, when one night late a mulatto man who resided at Jaguaribe knocked at my door, and told me that he had just arrived from a visit to a neighboring cottage, and that on the way 3 men had come out upon him, and had commanded him to stop. But on seeing him alone they had retreated. I had had some intimation of what I was to expect, and immediately supposed by whom these persons must have been sent, and for whom the blow was intended. I called 2 Indians and my faithful slave Manuel, and accompanied by these and the mulatto man who had given me the information, I set out towards the spot. They were gone, but we pursued. However, before we reached the nearest plantation, we heard the heavy gate of its field shut to. Therefore it was useless to proceed farther, for the persons, whoever they were, had reached a place of safety. Upon this path resided the families of the neighborhood with whom I was the most intimate, and it was well known that I sometimes returned home at a late hour. This was a turbulent district in which I had fixed my residence. Some of the owners of the plantations around were perpetually squabbling, and I had been led into the same way of proceeding. Indeed, if I had not done so, I should have been trampled upon. The slaves of Paulistas and of Timbo were constantly at war, and the owners of the plantations of Timbo and Jinipapero were likewise with lawsuits always pending, and their dependence never easy. Some districts are in a quieter state than others, but very few are totally without disturbance, and there are few plantations in any part of the province, about the boundaries of the lands of which more than one lawsuit has not been entered into. Footnote. At the distance of 20 leagues or more from Recife, there resided formerly the Padre Pedro upon the sugar plantation of Agua Azul, or the Blue Water. He had obtained a grant from the Crown of the surrounding lands of 1 square league in extent, and had fixed his dwelling upon a high hill, the summit of which was only to be reached by a serpentine road which he had made with great labor. The sugar works were likewise upon the hill, and the field around the eminence was enclosed by a deep and broad ditch, and a thick hedge on the outside. The situation was remote, and the adjoining country was in a very wild state. The woods were extensive and almost impenetrable. The disposition of the priest was as wild as the country in which he delighted to reside. All deserters from the regiment of the line, and all persons who had committed crimes in supporting the insulted honor of their families, in quarrels and provocations exciting momentary violence of passion, were received by him, but he did not afford protection to the thief. The fellows who were harbored by him inhabited the woods around the field, and some of them had erected their huts upon the sides of the hill, thus forming a line of communication, so that with a whistle or a conch soon were assembled at his door 40 or 50 men, who were prepared to perform any service of whatever description he might name, because they well knew that if they were bereft of his protection, his aid would be given in the law's support. To injure the priest or any of his satellites was followed by destruction to the offending person. He was, however, in the habit of sending many presents to the chief persons in office, that no notice might be taken of his proceedings, for although the government might not be able to destroy his feudal independence, still it might have shaken his power. The priest was once sent for by a late governor of the province. He obeyed and brought with him a considerable number of the determined followers. He dismounted and ascended the steps of the palace, leaving directions to his people, who remained below, that no person should be permitted to enter after him. The governor complained to him of his avowed practice of harboring deserters, to which the priest replied that he thought his excellency was aware of the inutility of speaking to him upon that subject. And having said this, he immediately left the room, mounted his horse, and proceeded homewards without molestation. Another anecdote of this strange man was communicated to me by a person who had witnessed the transaction. 2 officers of justice, or bailiffs, arrived at Agua Azul, and served a writ for debt upon him. The priest received them with great calmness, but shortly afterwards he ordered his people to take these 2 men and harness them in the mill, which was then at work, in the place of 2 of the horses. 8 of these are employed at the same time. He then ordered that the work should go on, and that a negro boy should sit above and make these unfortunate fellows assist in its movement. There they remained for some minutes, until, half dead with fatigue and fear, he turned them loose, and told them to relate to their employer the manner in which they had been treated, threatening to do the same to him if he could obtain possession of his person. The priest had a considerable number of bloodhounds, which were usually unchained, and were lying about the house, thus rendering dangerous an approach to his dwelling. The animals were well trained, for a call from their master was sufficient to make them lie still, and allow the advance of a stranger. This person died only a few years ago, but as I have already elsewhere said, the time for such characters in Brazil is fast going by. End footnote. I was often reminded by many of my new acquaintances that every plantation ought to have a chaplain, and I was told that without a doubt all those persons who attended to hear Mass would contribute towards the payment of the priest, as is customary. I spoke to a young man of this profession for the purpose, and he attended every Sunday and holiday. But when he was dismissed, at the time I was preparing to leave the place, I was left to pay him entirely myself. Everyone was poor and unable to assist when the time of payment came. This was only what I expected, but I thought it was right to follow the usual custom of having Mass said regularly on account of the slaves. In April I arranged with a tenant of the lands which lie to the eastward of Jaguaribe, and are called Mangarape, to allow me to turn loose upon them all my cattle during the rainy season, for the field of the plantation was not sufficiently large to support so great a number of animals during the whole year, as the work which was performed upon it required. The lands upon which I intended the cattle to remain are about 1 league in length, and of about half the breadth. Part of them are under water in the rainy season, and in other places they were covered with woods, but these were, for the most part, to be entered even on horseback, owing to the cattle feeding in them and beating down the brushwood. It was astonishing to see in how short a period the cattle which had been accustomed to labor became wild and comparatively fierce. I was in the habit of going occasionally with another person, both of us being on horseback, to collect the animals for the purpose of seeing that none were missing. We had many hard chases after them, and got many blows from the branches of the trees, etc. One of the oxen was in the habit of invariably going into a bog when we appeared, and after having proceeded to a certain distance, he would turn round and look at us with apparent unconcern, and as if he were conscious that we could not reach him. This circumstance makes me recollect another, which occurred with one of my pack horses. The animal escaped from Jaguaribe, and was not for a long time heard of, but at last I inquired of an old black man, who said that he saw him every day. The horse fed upon some lands which produced excellent grass, but the only water in the neighborhood was to be obtained from a well or hole, of which the entrance was narrow, and the water considerably below the surface. The negro said that one day he found the horse near to the well, but unable to reach the water. He gave him some out of a half-gourd which the old man carried with him, for the purpose of throwing water over his own head, in default of a better bath. The following day the horses were there, and this continued for weeks, but although he had attempted to put his hand upon his neck, the horse never allowed him to seize his mane. He was caught at last by 2 men, mounted on very swift-going horses, whom I sent for the purpose. A short time after the cattle had been at Maranguape, I agreed with an Indian to go and stay there, for the purpose of taking care of them. This man was in my debt for clothing, and for a gold chain which he had given to his wife. He came to me a few days after his removal, asking leave to go to his former place of residence, which was at some distance, and to take his family with him. I understood what this meant. He would never return, and therefore I answered that he might go if he thought proper, but must leave some pledge for the payment of the debt. This he promised to do. Julio, who had been with me on my journey to Sierra, was again in my service. He now displeased me exceedingly, for he too, led astray by this fellow, wished to leave me. Julio had been accused of some petty thefts, with which I now taxed him. He denied having committed them, and that he was innocent I verily believe. However, I did not think so then. Consequently, this circumstance, and his wish to leave me with a man whom I knew to be very unprincipled, for I had lately had information respecting him from other quarters, and above all the suspicion that he had come at an hour when few persons were about me, under the impression that, being alone, I should be induced to accede to their demands, caused us to part on bad terms. They went their way towards Maranguape, and I had some hopes that all would have continued quiet. However, in the afternoon, about half an hour before the close of the day, the manager came to tell me that Francisco José, the Indian, who was in my debt, had passed through the field, accompanied by his wife, Julio, and a number of other Indians. Thus he had determined to go in defiance of any right which I might have to his services, or to demand payment of what he owed me, and in breach of promise given to me only a few hours before. Several other laborers were also indebted to me, and if this man was, without opposition, permitted to make his own terms, I knew not who might choose to follow his example. My horse was brought out. I beckoned to Manuel, my constant companion, and calling to some freemen, who had returned from their work and were now talking together in a group, I said, "Who follows me?" A black carpenter, a white brickmaker, a mulatto carrier, and a laborer of the same caste, and likewise another slave, stepped forwards. Thus, accompanied by 6 able men, including Manuel, who were all on foot, I set off on horseback at a round pace, knowing that in ascending the hill they would pass me. The hill being surmounted, I again pushed on, and when I arrived at the short but steep declivity which overlooks the plantation of Inamam, I saw 3 men below, and heard the shrill Indian pipe. I looked back, and saw that the carpenter and brickmaker had alone kept pace with me, and I know not how they were able to do so. I cried out, "Yonder are some of the party." At that same moment, Monche, the brickmaker, fairly leapt down the steep declivity and passed my horse. We descended upon the men, but were disappointed in discovering that, although they were Indians, they were not those which we sought. Now we waited for the remainder of our party, who soon came up, and we returned quietly by another path towards home. On our arrival at the gate of Jaguaribe, I was informed that the party had quartered itself in a corner of the field in and about the hut of another Indian. To this place we now directed our steps. Francisco José himself came out to speak to me, and soon several others placed themselves near to him. I sat on horseback, holding a parley, my men being on the other side of me, until Antonio, the mulatto carrier, he who had been waylaid a long time before, came round and leaned against the horse's neck, placing himself between me and the Indian. I afterwards found out that he had observed that Francisco José had a drawn knife, and Antonio judged that this was intended against me or my horse, for the Indian well knew that if he wounded me, it would probably enable him to escape. Several persons belonging to the plantation had now joined us, and the matter ended by the Indian allowing himself to be taken without resistance, and to be put into the stocks. A party of mulattoes or of Creole negroes would not have submitted thus quietly. Late at night he paid the debt, was released, and I saw no more of him for a considerable time. I was now dismissing all those workmen who were not in debt to me, and at last only a few persons remained, whose services I required, and upon whose character I could depend. It was very seldom that I visited Recife, but when there was a necessity for so doing, I took advantage of moonlight nights in preference to traveling in the daytime, and was on these occasions accompanied by Manuel. The wood of Meruera, through which we usually passed, is famous for the numerous stories of ghosts that wander, and of murders that have been committed in it. One night, when the moon was not at a sufficient height to afford a tolerably clear view of the objects around, we were passing through this wood. I saw a figure before me, in the middle of the path, which bore the appearance of a man standing still. I slackened my pace and called out, as is customary, "Who comes there?" But before I could possibly have received an answer, Manuel brushed past, saying, "Let me see." However, I desired him to be quiet, as no harm might be intended. On a nearer approach, we discovered that an old stump of a tree had caused this alarm. On another occasion, I sent this same slave from Recife to Jaguaribe on foot, early in the morning, telling him that I intended to follow him, leaving Recife about 8 o'clock in the evening. I was to be accompanied by Zacarias, another slave, whose courage was somewhat doubtful. Manuel arrived at Jaguaribe and immediately prepared one of the pack horses, saying to the manager that he was going to meet his master, who was on the road alone, for he said, "Zacarias is nobody." Footnote: Zacarias não é ninguém. End footnote. The manager could not persuade him to give up his intention, and therefore, as he knew that the slave was much tired with his walk, he came himself. I mention these anecdotes for the purpose of showing the kind of man who usually followed me wherever I went. Several months now succeeded each other without any disquietude. I had another attack of ague during the rainy season, which was, however, much less violent than that of the preceding year. I likewise met with an accident, which had nearly proved fatal, occasioned by a blow from the forefeet of a high-fed horse. He reared and struck me, but this was done more in playfulness than with the intent to do mischief. I had had some intention of leaving Jaguaribe, owing to the turbulence of the neighborhood, to my ill health, and to some disagreeable occurrences which had taken place between my landlord and myself. However, as this would have been very inconvenient, I resolved to stay, notwithstanding all these and other disadvantages. Preparations were made in the month of August for setting the mill to work. The cane had not attained this year its accustomed growth in most parts of the country, and that which I possessed was particularly stinted in size, for I had not commenced planting until it was almost too late. Everything being ready towards the end of the month, I sent for a priest to bless the works. Unless this ceremony is performed, every person who is to be employed about the mill, both freeman and slave, would be afraid to proceed to his destined labor, and if any accident happened, it would be ascribed to the wrath of heaven for this breach of religious observance. The priest arrived and said mass, after which we breakfasted, and then proceeded to the mill. The manager and several other freemen and the negroes stood around the works. A quantity of cane was placed ready to be thrust in between the rollers, and the 4 negroes, whose part it was to feed the mill, stood at their posts. 2 lighted candles were placed close to the rollers, upon the platform which sustains the cane, and a small image of our Saviour upon the cross stood between them. The priest took his breviary and read several prayers, and at stated places, with a small bunch of weeds prepared for the occasion, which he dipped in a jug of holy water, he sprinkled the mill and the persons present. Some of the negroes sprang forwards to receive a good quantum of the sanctified water. And then the master of the sugar boiling house led the way to the portion of the works of which he had the direction, and here there was another sprinkling. When we returned to the part of the mill in which the rollers stood, the priest took a large cane, and I did the same. Then, the signal being given, the floodgate was opened, and the works were soon in motion, and according to rule, the 2 canes which the priest and I held in our hands were the first to be ground. I had heard much of this ceremony from persons of the country, and I cannot avoid saying that although something of the ridiculous may, by many persons, be attached to it, Still, I could not help feeling much respect for it. The excitement of devout feelings among the slaves, even of those feelings which are produced by the Roman Catholic religion, cannot fail to be serviceable, and if men are to exist as slaves, this is doubtless the religion which is the best adapted to persons in a state of subjection. Slavery and superstition are, however, two evils which, when combined, are surely sufficient to cause the misery of any country. The carts, the oxen, and their drivers had not received the priest's benediction. They arrived some time afterwards, bringing loads of canes, and the carts were ornamented with the longest that could be picked out, placed as flag staffs, and bearing upon them handkerchiefs and ribbons. Each cart in succession stood before the door of the dwelling-house, and the priest complied with the wishes of the drivers. There was a tall, thin mulatto man of about 55 years of age, of the name of Vicente, who lived near to Jaguaribe. He was in the habit, when he saw me about my own place, of stopping, that we might have some conversation. I liked much to hear his stories. He said that now the country was becoming quieter, that disturbances were less frequent than formerly, that there were now no valentoins, valiant ones, nor any contas verdes, green beads. He explained to me the precise meaning of the former, and the species of beads which were intended to be described by the latter. These valentoins were men of all castes, whose whole business consisted in seeking opportunities of quarrelling. They attended all festivals and fairs, and their desire was to become so famous for courage as to render the knowledge of their presence on these occasions sufficient to keep in awe any other individuals who might wish to create disturbances, considering themselves privileged to revenge their own and their friends' injuries. But they would not allow of any quarrel in which they were not concerned. Two roads cross each other at about the distance of 1 league from Jaguaribe, and at this spot Vicente told me that some of these men often stood, obliging all passers-by either to fight them or to dismount, take off their hats, and leave the horses whilst they were in sight. These men wore round their necks strings of green beads, which had either come from the coast of Africa, bearing the wonderful property of conveying in safety their possessors through all descriptions of perils, or were charmed by mandingueiros, African sorcerers, who had been brought over to Brazil as slaves, and in secret continued the prohibited practice of imparting this virtue to them. The men were accompanied by dogs of extraordinary size and activity, and possessing courage equal to that of their masters. These animals had been taught to drink rum, which they would do at their owner's command, giving to all beholders an opinion of some supernatural qualities having bestowed upon them. Vicente had been acquainted with some of these men, and was firmly persuaded of the virtues of the green beads, and that the dogs imbibed from their masters certain qualities which made them superior to all the rest of their species. The expression of the man's countenance changed entirely when he commenced the relation of these stories. It was at all times harsh, but now there was imparted to it a considerable degree of unpleasant wildness. When I expressed my doubts of the efficacy of the beads against a musket ball well directed, his anger rose, but there was pity mingled with it, for one who had not seen those times of wonder. He seemed to be glad that they were over, and that all was now quiet, but yet he cherished a sort of regard for men whose lives had been passed in deeds of danger. For, notwithstanding the charms, such he considered them to be, the death of these men was generally violent, owing, as Vicente said, to some unfortunate removal of the beads from the person of him whose destined hour was arrived. It was not, however, from this person alone that I heard accounts of the valentoins. Footnote: a man of large property, being much provoked at some outrage which had been committed by one of these valentoins, who was a white man, had said at his own home that when he met the man he would horsewhip him. This was repeated to the outlaw, and shortly afterwards they met accidentally in one of the narrow paths in the neighbourhood. The valentin was well armed with musket, sword, and a knife. He requested the gentleman to stop, as he had something to say to him. The outlaw asked him for a pinch of snuff, and then offered his own box, from which a pinch was in like manner taken. He then mentioned the injurious words which had been repeated to him. The unfortunate offender directly imagined what would follow, and therefore set spurs to his horse, but the road was without any bend for some distance. The Valentin knelt down upon one knee and fired with the effect which he wished for. He quietly walked on along the same road, telling the whole story of his meeting at the first village through which he passed. This man was at last taken, tried, and hanged at Bahia, through the very great exertions of the brother of the person whom he had murdered. He could not be executed at Pernambuco, because he was a white man. The transaction occurred at a short distance from Jaguaribe, about 15 years ago. There was an old Creole Negro residing in the neighborhood of Jaguaribe, whose disposition led him to explore all the woods for miles round in search of game. He preferred this manner of obtaining subsistence to that of daily labor with the hoe or billhook. He was acquainted with the situations in which the best timber was to be found, and could, in many instances, name the exact spot upon which some particular tree stood, which was required for any given purpose. This man often came to Jaguaribe, and on these occasions I usually called him into the house to hear his stories, whilst I sat in my hammock smoking. He was fond of tales of ghosts and mandingueiros. The latter are famous, among other feats, for handling poisonous snakes, and can, according to his account, and that of many other persons, by peculiar noises or tunes, call these reptiles from their hole, and make them assemble around him. These sorcerers profess to render innoxious the bites of snakes to persons who submit to their charms and ceremonies. One of the modes which is adopted for this purpose is that of allowing a tame snake to crawl over the head, face, and shoulders of the person who is to be curado de cobras, cured of snakes, as they term it. The owner of the snake repeats a number of words during the operation, of which the meaning, if they contain any, is only known to the initiated. The rattlesnake is said to be, above all other species, the most susceptible of attention to the tunes of the mandingueiros. The above accounts I should not have related upon the authority of one or two persons. I have heard them repeated by several individuals, and even some men of education have spoken of the reputed efficacy of the tame snakes of the mandingueiros, as if they were somewhat staggered in their disbelief of it. The reputation of the contra verges is firmly established in the faith of those persons of the lower ranks who have heard of them. These men certainly do play strange tricks very dexterously. I had not been so much inconvenienced by snakes as I had imagined I should. I had seen several different kinds in going through the woods, and particularly in that which leads from Jaguaribe to Paulistas. The path through it is not much frequented, and therefore the snakes have become bolder, crossing the road or running up a bank as I passed along. One afternoon I had a visit, with which I could have well dispensed. I happened to look up while sitting in my hammock, and saw one of these reptiles lying quite still upon the top of the wall of the room, in the opening which is formed by the supporters of the roof that rest upon it. I seized a pike and ran it into the snake, thus riveting it to one of the beams of the roof, whilst I called to some person to assist me in killing it, but its writhing was so violent that it soon liberated itself, and fell from a wall on the outside, where several persons waited for it. The people who were present did not know whether it was the caninana or papa ovo, egg-eater, species, as these are much like to each other. The former is accounted venomous, and the latter is by many persons supposed to be harmless. Both are of a grey colour above and yellow underneath. The snake which we killed was about 4 feet in length. The caninana is likewise sometimes called the flying snake, as it has the power of springing to a considerable distance. It usually lies entwining the branch of a tree, and from thence darts down upon those who may molest it. The cobra d'agua, or water snake, was often to be seen in the rivulet which runs just below the dwelling-house of Jaguaribe. It is sometimes 8 or 10 feet in length, and of the thickness of a man's arm. The color of the back is a bright black, and the belly is of a pale yellow. The lower ranks of people say that it is poisonous, but I have heard this contradicted. The jararaca snake is from 6 to 9 feet in length. The back is of a dusky yellow, and the belly is white. The point of the tail is black, the mouth is red, and it has 2 black and white streaks upon the throat. The surucucu snake is of nearly the same size as the jaraasa. It is black and yellow. This reptile is attracted by fire, and on this account would be more dangerous to travelers than any other description of snake, if its attention were not so totally directed to the fire as to give time and opportunity of killing it. It has, as I was informed by many persons of credibility, been known to spring off the ground at a person carrying a flambeau. The surucucu and the jaraasa are known to be poisonous. The sipo snake is so called from its likeness to the thin and flexible shoots of the plants which bear this name. It is said to be poisonous. Charms are often supposed to destroy the venom of snakes and to produce, consequently, the recovery of the person who has been bitten by one of these reptiles. Oil is sometimes used as a remedy, being given in considerable quantities, which are increased or diminished according to the quality of the oil. Rum is likewise administered so as to produce intoxication. I have also seen a small plant which is known under the name of herba cobrera. Wherever I have seen it, the plant has been carefully preserved in a pot. This would denote that it is not indigenous to the part of the country in which I was, and indeed I was told that it had been brought from Africa. I never saw its flowers. The leaves of it are small and heart-shaped. The stem is of 4 or 5 inches in length, and of a deep red color, which becomes greenish towards the points of the branches. These are long, crooked, and spread horizontally. The leaves and the softer branches are bruised and are applied to the wound, and the juice which is extracted from them, when mixed with rum or water, is drank by the patient. I do not vouch for its success, but its name must, I should imagine, have been acquired by its reputation. The mill was yet at work in September, when the owner of the place applied to me to leave it, as it was convenient for him to come down from another plantation, of which he was the owner, and reside at Jaguaribe, from its vicinity to Recife. I agreed to this, but did not wish that he should remove until I was about to leave Jaguaribe. However, one morning, a young man who was related to and employed by him came to my house, and told me that by order from his kinsman he had, accompanied by a gang of negroes, taken possession, during the night, of the cottage, which was situated upon the shelf of the hill. I expressed my surprise at this conduct, and said a good deal upon the subject. He, of course, returned for answer that he had only acted according to the orders which he had received. The principal objection which I had to the premature removal arose from the general turbulent character of the slaves of this man, and from the frequency of quarrels between the dependents of those persons whose dwellings were so near to each other as ours had now become. Several extremely disagreeable occurrences took place, as I had feared would be the case, before I could conveniently remove, but as these proceeded more particularly from the peculiarity of our situation, I do not think that a minute account of them would be interesting. These anecdotes could not be given in illustration of the general state of matters in the country. Suffice it to say that I made a visit to the owner of the plantation of Amparo in the island of Itamarasa, upon whose lands I agreed to plant sugar canes, and to share with him their produce, as is a usual practice upon sugar estates. In the beginning of November, 1813, I sent my manager to prepare a residence for me at the town of Concepcion in the island, and I removed to that place in the course of the following month. End of Section 18. End of Volume 1. End of Travels in Brazil by Henry Koster.